Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cyber Pass. I have here today with me Georg Rockall-Schmidt and the Academic Agent, and we are about to talk about early British film comedies. So I believe, as I gathered from our previous direct message Twitter exchange, that the Academic Agent has been categorizing. Well, George and I were left clueless. So I'll hand over to the Academic Agent and let him leap into the first category he's set up here.
Well, I mean, it all sounds more impressive than it is. Essentially, what I did is I've got a sheet of A4 paper here, and I've just written down 4 general groupings of films. And I thought a logical place to start was the Ealing comedies of the late 40s and the early 50s. And really, when it comes to these comedy films, it seems that you tend to get like a string of films all with a similar cast, right? So, all of these films are Alec Guinness vehicles, essentially, where he gets to show off a lot of his comic chops. But Dennis Price also is in some of them. Stanley Holloway, Margaret Rutherford crops up once or twice. And I'm thinking of Kind Hearts and Coronets, Lavender Hill Mob, Passport to Pimlico, the Ladykillers. So,
yeah.
I guess the first question is, have you seen? There is one of those films I have not yet seen. Believe it or not, I've seen 3 of them, but one I've yet to watch. But what about you guys? Have you seen them all? Or
I think I can claim that I'm sort of nerdy enough to have more than likely watched my way through all the Ealing comedies. Yes,
I've definitely not seen them all, but I've seen a good portion of them. Same with the Boulting Brothers stuff. I've seen a good portion of them, a lot long enough for me not to be useful to you guys and not to really offer that much. But I've seen a lot of them, and I think I get the gist. Is that too vague?
Well, I mean, I think what categorizes them is a very, how should we say, a very sort of gentle humor.
Right.
It wasn't as bawdy as it got later when it came to Carry On films, as they sort of continued onwards.
Right.
I mean, the Alec Guinness films tend to be sort of very light touch, don't they? It's not goof-off stuff, but more stuff that you kind of chuckle at, and it somehow sticks in the memory. I mean, particularly some of the black humor in some of the Ealing comedies.
Sorry, go on, Academic.
I was just going to say, I quite like the, I guess, the slightly cruel edge that you get in these films sometimes, and the, how can I put it, there's no easy way to, just the utter level of poshness of everything.
Yes. I watched Kind Hearts and Coronets yesterday, which is listed as an Ealing comedy, and I was watching it and I was thinking, this isn't funny. This is about a sociopath who's killing people for his own gain and doesn't have the self-awareness to realize it's wrong, and that kind of fits in with the poshness thing, because it's also stiff. I could almost believe it was filmed in 1890 or whenever it's set.
One of my favorite bits of Kind Hearts and Coronets is when he's at the end and they have that fight, and there's that the old kind of army guy there, and he just turns around to him and he says, "It is quite clear that you are insane." I love that.
When he says to him, he's caught in a man trap, isn't he? And he says, "I'll shoot you, and then I'll say you stepped into the trap and the gun went off." And you think, yes, this man is insane. This man is a dangerous psychopath.
Yeah, I think that one particular kind of almost stands out a little as something on its own, because it is much more stilted in that regard.
It's very stilted and it's very dry.
Yes, I mean, I don't think you can get much drier than that particular film. There is no sort of delivery of a joke, so to speak. It's a principle that is comic and then is just seen through ruthlessly from the beginning to the end.
But you see, this is one of the things that I mean, I've complained about this on my unpopular opinions stream before British show, but the Americans, they seem to want to always signpost comedy. They always want to say, here is the punchline coming up, and now you've had it, and now you're allowed to laugh. And this is what I really like about Kind Hearts and Coronets and these films in general, where it's just it plays everything so straight that you're never quite sure, it doesn't signal where you're meant to laugh. And I quite like that kind of cut glass iciness of it.
There is one scene though, which is very different. I'm surprised they didn't cut it. Really, do you remember the scene where Alec Guinness plays 9 people, I think, and one of them he plays an admiral, or at least a captain of a battleship, and he says port, and his first officer says, surely it means starboard, and he says no, port. And then you get these 2 model ships crashing into each other, and that was the only time in the entire film I could identify that is a joke, for sure. And it was just so incongruent with the rest of the film. I just thought that is this part of a different film that they've put in there almost. But Academic, I kind of disagree with what you said about American signposting comedy. I think that often is the case, but I think later on when you look at some British comedies from, I'm thinking specifically the 90s, I think British comedies got into signposting stuff as well.
Which ones are you thinking of in particular? Can you?
Well, I'm thinking of things like Men Behaving Badly, and that sort of era.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, across the pond, you've got Arrested Development, which I think you can watch, and if you don't watch it carefully, a lot of stuff washes over you, and you don't realize it's there. So I'm not sure. I think that's a bit of
Yeah, I would say generally my thinking kind of stops somewhere in the mid 80s when I'm making these when I'm making these generalizations, because I do think you get a lot more cross pollination. I also think that the Americans do have some very, very sophisticated comedy. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of Seinfeld or Woody Allen, for example. I mean, they do have lots of very, very clever stuff. But I'm just thinking as a general rule, I'd expect the American stuff to signpost a bit more. Although you can find exceptions for every rule. So that's a kind of nebulous comment, I suppose.
I mean, one thing I would sort of like to get to is, we all agree in that regard that the Ealing comedies do have a certain sort of posh touch to them. But not all of them necessarily are terribly posh, because when you think of Passport to Pimlico, which is kind of, this kind of neighborhood in the East End of London, then yes, you've got ministers in it and people like that who are terribly posh, so that they were capable of using their same stock cast at times. But the actual people playing the shopkeepers and whatever were then working class characters. So it wasn't as if it was only just people in bowler hats and pinstripe suits.
But it usually concentrates on those people, doesn't it? Even if the working class people are there, they're more kind of incidental.
I know what you mean, but I think in that particular film, and I think that one is generally seen as one of their best. That's when they are actually more at the forefront.
Okay, that's interesting.
I don't know. I mean, are you familiar with Passport to Pimlico?
No, it's one of those movies that I've seen, but not for a long time.
Because I mean, in a strange way, of course, it's almost relevant again these days because of the whole Brexit affair. Because the whole situation was a kind of part of Britain breaking away from Britain at the time.
Is that the one where they start to set up their own state or something?
Yes.
It's a long time ago.
The part of that part of London, that district called Pimlico, they find in a bomb crater, because this is right after the war. I think was it 1949 or whatever this was filmed.
That's right.
So there was still plenty of parts of London that were still seriously ravaged from bombing. So in a bomb crater, they find the sort of the entrance to a cellar of some ancient building that had long been forgotten, if you know what I mean. And in there, they find a treasure, and B, the indication that this was actually donated by the British Crown to the Duke of Burgundy, who had
Right.
left France or whatever. So they realize that because this has never been technically revoked, that they are now the independent state of Burgundy.
And they can get around rationing and things like that.
Yes, they can get around rationing because British no longer applies to them. And at the same time, the treasure is theirs. So then you've got this kind of to and fro between the British government that obviously want the money, and at the same time want to kind of impose law, and this little island in the middle of London that is kind of, is declaring independence, but is suddenly realizing that independence is perhaps not all it's made up to be. And it's a charming little story of neighbors that are sort of trying to work out how on earth, to get by. Because the moment they don't have the state anymore, of course, they also lose the police force and everything. So they're having to somehow sort of improvise as they're going along.
It sounds like it's something that could be remade now, like you say with the whole Brexit thing.
Yeah, as I say, one could kind of give it a kind of Brexit touch if you want. Because it's got a lot to do with precisely that, independence. What is independence? What parts of independence do you like, and what parts of independence are actually burdens that you need to carry, and things like that. So obviously they find themselves overrun by hawkers because suddenly there are no regulations and whatever, and they suddenly find that they need to kind of enforce their own borders. And at the same time, the British government is also, playing hardball because they want that money that's been found, because obviously the British government after the Second World War was not too well up. So in the end, they find themselves kind of cut off. They're kind of utterly besieged. And it's an interesting one. Then eventually, obviously, it's hardly a surprise that everything is a happy ending, and Britain is back being one again, if you know what I mean. But as such, that sort of little journey of how they get there is quite an interesting one. So I think that one really is a sort of truly little charming little tale where you've got the British public to sympathise with a bunch of people who break away from Britain itself because they're sick and tired of rationing and such things.
Well, it sounds like I need to revisit that. But if you remade it, you couldn't have it in Pimlico, could you? You'd have to choose a different place in London, right?
But yes, I mean,
so where would it be now?
That's what I was thinking. Passport to Vauxhall. I don't know, because Pimlico I now associate with. Well, I associate it with MI6, but more specifically, I associate it with. Do you remember that MI6 agent or officer who may or may not have trapped himself in his own suitcase?
Oh yes. Actually, I was just talking about him on my weekend program. Yes, that the chap who what is it, in 2013 it was believed he had locked himself in his bag. By the time they got to 2015, they believed that was no longer the case and whatever. So it's had several versions of official version, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's some sort of film there or something like it. I don't know. I mean, going back to kind of where you would set the remake. I mean, I guess if you want it to be working class, what would it be? Passport to Hounslow. But maybe that's too far out.
Well, I think we very quickly get into some of the demographic realities of London in 2018 and realize that you probably have to. You probably have to set it in Essex or something to retain the flavour of what you want to do there. Wouldn't you? I'm skirting around something, but I lived in Mile End for a while, and I wouldn't set it in Mile End, for example.
Passport to Hackney, and it could be
Passport to Hackney.
the people who want all the Starbucks in Hackney and everything, the people who want to gentrify Hackney are ousted by the local people.
Right.
I don't know.
You should get it could be a Diane Abbott vehicle, maybe.
Diane Abbott
she's trying to establish her utopia.
Yes, but there's the problem, isn't it? Because Ealing comedies as such always had that touch, that light touch that was rather charming.
Yes,
and yeah,
and that is lost as soon as you
into
introduce a
anything
Diane
that
Abbott
would be a
character.
Diane Abbott style vehicle would be somewhat of a trial for the director, I believe.
I suppose you could do it in some areas of Soho, which have retained their unique character. I'm told there are still like these little pockets of old London, but they're yeah. Can I just ask you guys what about Alec Guinness? Just to change the subject a little bit, but staying within the Ealing bucket, as it were,
Sure.
because I'm sure there are a lot of people who know Alec Guinness primarily for his Star Wars output. What do you think about Alec Guinness, the comic actor specifically, as we see him in these films? Because he does a lot of dressing up, doesn't he?
He does. He's like the shopkeeper in Mr. Ben.
What do you think of him in these films? Do you think he's a comic talent, or do you think what's your general view?
I think it kind of depends. When he's doing his kind of kind hearts and coronets moment, where he just plays endless characters of the same family, I find he can be a bit tiring. But when he does something like what was it called, the one where he's a sea captain in charge of a pier, Barnacle Bill, that's where I find him actually quite charming. That's where I think it works. I think he had talent as a comic actor, but he became very stilted when he was just playing family member number 17.
I find him a joy to watch because I think with some actors you can tell whether they enjoy acting or not. I think if you look at someone, maybe if you look at Christian Bale, who takes things very seriously and gives these very meaty performances, you can tell that he's suffered for his art. Whereas I get the sense with Alec Guinness, and obviously this is just conjecture, this is just my sense, but I think he really enjoys it. And I think that he was trained as a stage actor, and I kind of get the sense for him, films are. I mean, obviously, films became his main financial source and everything. But I think that he enjoys doing them, and that's why he does them.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was really just trailing off. I was just going to say, and I get the sense that his art is probably more stage. I was just thinking when I watched Kind Hearts and Coronets, it's got some similarities to An Inspector Calls, and I think I'm right in saying that when An Inspector Calls opened, Alec Guinness was playing Eric, who was the youngster in that, the 20-year-old, and I can kind of imagine him taking that experience into Kind Hearts and Coronets and kind of going with the flow. That's the sense I get from him. He goes with the flow, and it's not too kind of I'm an actor.
Well, really. One thing that you just sort of awakened a memory there when you spoke about that, about his having fun, whereas Christian Bale sort of suffers for his art. Because you'll forgive me if this is a complete tangent that has nothing to do with the actual subject, even though it does involve a famous British actor, and that is on the set of Marathon Man, where
yes, I know.
Dustin Hoffman is the poor American who is being tortured by this former Nazi doctor or dentist or whatever he is. And the dentist is being played by Laurence Olivier. And of course, Dustin Hoffman was all into method acting. So he plays in the film a chap who runs marathons and things like that. So, of course, he went running marathons. So he would arrive on the set, all sweaty, having run the marathon. And Laurence Olivier, of course, being, let's say, an actor of a different vintage, just sort of looked at him and went, "What are you doing, my boy?" And then he sort of tried to explain it to him. Well, this is the method. You have to suffer the way the character suffers, and you need to. And Laurence Olivier just famously looked at him and just went, "My boy, why don't you just act?" It goes without saying that Dustin Hoffman thereafter didn't particularly like Laurence Olivier.
One of the most ridiculous examples of the method taken to extreme degrees is in the film version of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. There's a scene in that. Obviously, that's a Daniel Day-Lewis film.
Yeah.
And there's a scene in that where I don't know if you guys have seen that, but they open this hatch, and John Proctor, who's the character that Day-Lewis is playing, like, he sees the sunlight, but the idea is that he's been in this kind of down this hole for 2 days because they're trying to make him confess that he's been consorting with the devil. But of course, Daniel Day-Lewis spent 2 whole days down this hole just so that when they opened that hatch, that first look of sunlight was authentic. I mean, that is kind of that's taking it a bit far, isn't it?
That's taking it a bit far. Well, in My Left Foot, he spent something like 8 weeks in a wheelchair. I mean,
Yes.
that's dedication. I mean, I respect it. I do.
Well,
I think
I'm waiting in that case for the next film in which they film the story of Christ and they actually truly nail the actor to the cross.
How many times is he going to actually retire and then like come back to make one last film? He's done that about 3 times now.
Yeah, he has. I think this might be it, though. For him.
They did say that last time.
Well, yeah. Well, no. I mean, yeah, that is the thing. Will it be or not? But I read quite a bit of what he said after Phantom Thread, and he didn't sound very positive about doing another film. He sounded like, I am done with this.
I will say that I am a big fan of the Daniel Plainview character in There Will Be Blood, but we're quite a long way from Ealing Comedies at this point.
Yes, if we want to sort of row it back to Ealing Comedies, because we were touching on Alec Guinness.
Well, one thing I wanted to say about The Kind Hearts and Corin, I mean that's like, my sense is that what Guinness was going for in that film, if you can remember, there's a family tree and there are all these very stiff looking kind of aristocrats on the family tree, and my sense is that it's all meant to be kind of like a painting come to life. So the stilted nature of all of those characters, I thought was by design, that it was meant to be a send up of just how stiff these people were and seemed, right? I mean, what do you think about that, British?
Well, the thing is, he did other films in which he played multiple characters, and whenever he does sort of an extended family or whatever, to my mind, they always end up rather stiff. So I'm not sure whether that was really just unique to that particular opening. So to my mind, I think when he did do those multiple roles, I think he just ended up being stiff per se. More than likely because he was behind that many prosthetics in those days that it more than likely did turn him somewhat wooden, because my guess is that those won't necessarily have been quite as advanced as the things they've got now.
Mm.
Well, do you want to talk about the Dennis Price thing that we talked a bit off air about this, British? But do you want to do this now, or should we talk about him in a bit when
we can always sort of sort of come back to Dennis Price. I just wanted to touch on, given we've got Alec Guinness, and that he will more than likely mean something to quite a bit of the audience because of the Star Wars connection. I was just wondering, are you too familiar with The Man in the White Suit?
Yeah,
not really.
I want to say I haven't seen that, actually.
Because I mean, he plays a sort of he plays a sort of boffin. Most of the film is kind of dedicated to the fact that he is sort of he's a scientist who seems to be discovering something, but he obviously has to work in the private sector, and they are not necessarily that interested in, you know, this madman's experiments, particularly because half of the time they blow up. But what he eventually manages to concoct, and remember, he is working in the textile industry, he comes up with a fabric that is
Oh, right.
indestructible. It doesn't, you know, it's resistant to dirt, so you can just brush off dirt. It's the super material, the one that is kind of, you know, the key to science, if you know what I mean. And they make a suit for him of it in order to demonstrate its versatility and whatever. But then it turns into a sort of completely different vehicle, because then it suddenly shows how the unions are dead set against him. You know, you've pretty much got mobs chasing him through the streets of this mill town in Lancashire. And at the same time, also the industrialists are getting together saying, you know, I think we need to do something here, because otherwise we're all going to be bankrupt. And you've basically suddenly got this technology coming up that will just wipe out everything and make it obsolete.
A wonderful metaphor for what we call Schumpeter's Gale, or creative destruction.
Yes, but I mean,
what actually happens in real life.
Again, we have got wonderful parallels with what is going on right now with the robotics and you know, artificial intelligence coming along.
It happens in every single disruptive technology that comes along. These special interest groups, who happen to be whoever's in the industry at the moment and the workers of that industry, try to stop it happening. And this has happened pretty much with every technology, from, you know, like ones that you don't even think of, like
let's looms, say, you know, going back to the mills, right?
Looms. I mean, famously in India, Gandhi wanted to stop the development of the textile industry to keep the old traditional loom industry going, because he thought it would lose jobs. But one that people don't think about is the ice workers. You know, the ice industry used to be massive because they used to have to get ice out of the mountains and transport it back to put in your drink. But of course, that industry was completely destroyed by the development of the fridge freezer that you have in people making ice in their homes, right?
And if it wasn't for that, it would have been Churchill's idea of kidnapping an iceberg and using it as an aircraft carrier.
Aircraft carrier, yes.
Yeah. So it's just interesting that whenever those things happen, you do get the unions and the industry heads trying to stop it, trying to, you know, stand in the way of history, as it were.
Well, I mean, in that case, that might be a film for you, Academic, because you know, when you've got the workers effectively chasing him through the streets of the town with torches and pitchforks, you do get a sort of existential message as to what it kind of means to them and what it means to him, if you know what I mean. Hence that poster that I just showed before, where he's actually running, he's at the gallop, so to speak, and that is really him in the white suit running around the town trying to avoid being slaughtered.
Great. I will. One thing I will say, and this is when I knew that we were going to do the stream, I wanted to, you know, just brush up, watch some of them. They're quite hard to get hold of, some of these films, if you want to actually stream them. And yet they've done this annoying thing where, you know, they're not on YouTube, so you can't watch them for free. But if you want to just, you know, stream them or buy them, quite difficult with a lot of them. I mean, I've got the Netflix, I've got the Google Play, I've got, you know, and lots of them just aren't online. And
yes, I think you'll have to go the old-fashioned way of just getting a DVD on Amazon.
How do you? I mean, I know you, George. You do a lot of film reviews, and how do you find that distribution? Because I find it frustrating with the older films that they're not all online. You'd think there'd just be a service where you could just, you know, get all the films of the 50s.
Yeah,
for
I
free
find
back.
a lot of this stuff is has been cornered by either Artificial Eye or what's it, Canal Studio. So like British was saying, you have to get the DVD because they've got the rights to them. You know, they probably picked up the rights to 20 films all at once for next to nothing. Because whenever I see these films, it's invariably in like a Tesco's bargain basket, you know, and you can buy this incredible classic for £2, and you know, then you look at, you know, Thor Ragnarok on Blu-ray for £30, and you think, oh,
Yeah, I think I know which one I'm getting. Yes.
yeah, right. But I agree, it is hard to get, and even clips. You know, often if I know a film very well, I won't need to get the whole film to use a clip in one of my videos. I'll just find a clip at, you know, whatever it is, Fandango clips or whatever, on YouTube. But they don't have any of these movies.
No.
So yeah, they are very cornered. And
The only video I've ever had to take down because of copyright was the one where I used a clip of I'm Alright Jack, which we're going to
Really?
be talking about. Yeah, and I was like, wow, they were, and it was like, I would say about half an hour after I uploaded it, I got the copyright notice. I was like, wow, those guys are hot, considering
Yes.
this is not available online anywhere.
That's weird.
Did you get the copyright notice from somewhere, you know, that sounded serious, or was it somewhere in southern Vietnam that the copyright notice came from?
They were always Italian in the first instance. There was like some Italian distributor.
Okay, well, that at least would be within the realm of the possible. Yes.
Yeah. You know, it's a tangent, but the weirdest copyright claim I ever got was on a clip, I think from 1995, of John Hurt talking to an Irish presenter on an Irish show, just talking about acting, and he just died, and I was trying to make a video about him, and it was manually reviewed in something like 30 seconds after I uploaded it, and then I re-uploaded it, edited, and it was manually reviewed again. And I think I ended up using something else. And yeah, anyway, sorry, we're not talking about that.
No, you're but
yeah,
no,
I will say one other one as well, super obscure. I used a 2-minute clip from an episode of Hitchcock's Half Hour from
Right.
the early 50s. I thought, you know, this is so obscure.
Is this Hitchcock's half hour or Hancock's half hour?
No, Alfred Hitchcock's
Okay.
kind of sci-fi TV show he had, and I even went to the trouble of putting a little TV box around it. And
right.
I still got a copyright for that as well. I was like, wow. I mean, it's not like these things are freely available. Probably more people will watch it as a result of watching my video than not. But I don't know. That was another very odd one where I thought, you know, this is so obscure, but it still got flagged up very quickly. So
yeah, no, I mean, going back to what you mentioned before, with, you know, where these things are available. I mean, I've made 3 or 4 little sort of short film reviews on sort of old British films so far, and yes, I have then got comments in the comment section. You know, could you next time you review something like this actually make sure it's available on Netflix?
Oh,
and I'm there just going, I'm sorry, but I don't even have Netflix, people.
and it changes all the time. I mean, Netflix in the US is much different to Netflix in the UK, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm never sure what's on it.
But yeah, I mean, I think it was particularly after I made Carlton Brown of the FO when I did that one, because I find that a sort of a lovely little charming film. But yeah, I obviously put it up thinking, well, you know, if people want to see it, they'll need to get the DVD. It never struck me that people were entirely reliant on it must be on some streaming service or else I'm not going to watch it.
I tell you something else while we're talking about the streaming services. And this is, I mean, I remember the days of Love Film. I don't know if you guys ever had that.
Yeah.
But one of the little bits of functionality that has been stripped out of all of these now, because, you know, they're all very like kind of flashy these days. So you just get a lot of images. And, you know, they've got all of these ways of filtering it by your own, you know, by your own tastes and all of this. But I used to love the first thing I do whenever I got one of these things is I get it to chronological order, and then I do reverse chronological to see what what random old stuff they have. That would be one of the first things I do. But in all the modern ones now, the Netflix and the Amazon Prime and so on, they've removed the sort by date thing, so you can no longer do that. And that has that's upset me a little bit, because it kind of assumes that you want to watch the latest and the greatest, as opposed to, if you're slightly more autistic, as I might be, I kind of like, saying, well, I just want to see films from the 70s tonight, or films from the 50s, or whatever. It's actually very difficult to sort through Netflix, I find.
I don't disagree. I mean, one of the things that Netflix has done recently, which almost makes me want to completely unsubscribe, is have autoplay.
Yes, yeah.
I know what I'm watching Netflix. I know what's next. I don't need you to play it now. I would have pressed play if I wanted you to play it now. Oh, yeah, technology.
That's true. Because sometimes you want to think during the credits as well. Sometimes you actually want to digest what's happened, and watch the credits play, or maybe you want to see who the dolly grip was, or whatever. But
right. Or sometimes, before I play the movie, I want to make a cup of tea and sit down and not have it start. Right. And
it starts automatically, as opposed to playing the trailer, which is what or just not do anything. How about just not do anything?
So it doesn't allow you your sort of movie rituals.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this isn't just a Netflix problem. Again, we're kind of moving away from the Ealing comedies. Sorry, chaps, we will go back, but I'm griping now. One thing that annoys me about news sites is they have stories in video, and the video is just images, and then there are subtitles at the bottom, so they don't expect you to even listen to it with the sound. And I always find invariably I can read an article faster than you can show me a 3-minute video. And sometimes I don't always want to read an article. Sometimes I already know what's going on, and I just want to see if it's been updated. I don't want to watch your video. And autoplay is not a good thing.
Well, shall we try moving away from autoplay?
I'm sorry.
No problem. We're here to go off on tangents, really. That's the whole purpose.
I think it's a good point to hit the Boulting Brothers.
Well, I was just wondering, if we can sort of touch on one or two things regarding Ealing, just in order to see whether this shakes anyone's tree or not. Are you familiar at all with Whisky Galore from Ealing Brothers? Just Ealing Studios.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen Whisky.
I am afraid I must be the lone nerd who is familiar with these things. Because Whisky Galore, the reason that one in particular is maybe of interest to people is because it's I mean, I think the British government deny it, but as such, it's believed to be based on a true story. And that is, you have to imagine we're talking Second World War here, and basically, whiskey is hardly top of the order when it comes to the necessities for the nation. So people in Scotland, in the Outer Hebrides and whatever, can't get their whiskey anymore. And then a ship that I think has either come over from Ireland or from the States, carrying whiskey, of all things, is somehow shipwrecked in a storm just off their islands. And the population is kind of warned off it and told, look, this is, this is government property or whatever. You can't go near this thing. It's too dangerous anyhow and whatever. But the population is so determined to get their hands on some whiskey that they kind of all collude with each other. And you've got this one sort of military commander of the island who is obviously desperate to try and enforce, government orders. And the entire population are in cahoots with each other that they will try and get their hands on this whiskey. And then once they've got the whiskey, they'll hide it away so no one can get at it. Because, of course, the authorities then start searching houses and whatever. I think in the end the whole ship sinks anyway, so all the evidence is gone, if you know what I mean. But whether one actually knows whether whiskey has been taken or not, one is absolutely certain that the population will have helped themselves.
Right.
So you've got this sort of wonderful situation of, the authorities being pitched directly against the people, and the people not wanting any of it. They're just all sticking together. And there's a real beauty about that. I mean, even the ordinary soldiers, of course, being kind of Dad's army types, who are just a home guard, they are, of course, with the people. So it becomes ever and ever harder for the officers to actually enforce their will, if you know what I mean. And then aside from that, of course, you've got one which surely the two of you will know. That is the Ladykillers.
Of course, yeah, I've seen that. That's I've got that one as a 1955. That must be quite late on in the old Ealing cycle.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that one was remade, wasn't it, with Tom Hanks? And I believe it was a bit of a
Yes.
Did you watch the Tom Hanks one? I don't think I've seen the Tom Hanks one.
It's not that bad. It's one of these movies where you think, why did they remake this? But it's okay. If it was something else, if the Ladykillers from 1955 hadn't existed, because it's the Coen brothers who made it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Coen brothers, yeah.
And I think it's kind of a very average Coen brothers outing, but it's okay. It's kind of fun. It's silly, and Tom Hanks is fun to watch.
I mean, the cast of the original, I mean, was just pretty stellar, wasn't it? I mean, you had Alec Guinness, you had Peter Sellers,
Cecil Parker.
Yeah, and then who was the real sort of the killer type? I'm trying to think of his name. Was it Herbert Lom?
Herbert Lom is what's his name? Harvey.
He's the sort of, he really looks the assassin in that one.
The one with the knife.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
The Ladykillers is my own Bernstein Bears. Do you know what I mean if I say that?
No, that doesn't mean anything to me.
It doesn't mean well, I don't blame you. Well, it's kind of. Do you know what the Mandela effect is?
No. What is this?
Isn't that everyone believes they remembered where they were when Mandela died or something like that?
Some people think that or some people are sure that they remembered reading an article in a newspaper or something about Nelson Mandela dying in his jail cell in the 80s. And the Bernstein Bears, or the Bernstein Bears, I guess, is a more American thing, where there's a children's book, and some people remember it being called the Bernstein Bears, and some people are sure it was the Bernstein Bears, and kind of jokingly, people say, well, it's obviously evidence of parallel dimensions, moving into each other. Of course it's not that. It's a misremembering thing, but I always remember the Ladykillers as being in black and white. I am sure that there's been at least 3 times where I've sat down to watch the Ladykillers. It started and I thought, it's in color. It's not in color, is it? Is this a colorized version? But it was filmed in color. But I always remember it as in black and white.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I mean, I was now just thinking of it. I was thinking of it as a black and white movie.
Me too.
Yeah, and it is in color, and I'm always shocked.
Yes, some films have that effect where you somehow remember them in black and white, but then you see them and you, precisely what you said, you begin wondering, is this a colorized version?
Yeah. What is the story here? Yeah.
I've just seen that in 1999, the BFI surveyed 1,000 people from the world of British film to produce the BFI 100 for the 20th century. Do you want to know where Ladykillers ranked?
Oh, go on then.
It came 13th. And just for posterity, Kind Hearts and Coronets came 6th overall.
Well, that's good.
Then I have one more question for you, and that is because there is one Ealing comedy we haven't mentioned here, and that is perhaps one of the top ones, and I could imagine that might be higher on that list, and that's the Lavender Hill Mob.
The Lavender Hill Mob was 17th.
Oh my
Your
God.
Whiskey Galore was 24.
Yeah.
And there's another. Is there any more? I think there's one more on the list. The Man in the White Suit, 58. Passport to Pimlico, 63. So they all ranked, basically.
Yeah.
what I
I
can
think
see.
that's very encouraging.
So there we go. Ealing, pretty good showing on the top 100 there. So
Yeah, I mean the Lavender Hill Mob again. We've got Stanley Holloway, we've got Alec Guinness in the main role, and then we've got Sid James, haven't we?
Yep.
As one of the rogues, one of the actual heavies they try and find. Again, that's a sort of a wonderful juxtaposition of the poshness of Ealing with
Well,
Alec
it's
Guinness
Audrey
and
Hepburn as
Stanley
well, isn't it?
Holloway. Yes, yes, I think that's her first ever appearance. Is because he plays. When it comes to it, they're actually arresting him in South America, aren't they? Where he has been in exile.
Yeah, he's
Um,
in some bar, and
yes, and
Audrey
he is.
Hepburn, I remember, is we see her straight away, but she's
Yes,
a very minor character.
and she's basically he is reminiscing about how he got the money with which he made with which he made his getaway, and then Audrey Hepburn is sort of the barroom beauty or whatever who comes over, and he kind of introduces her to the policeman, and I think puts some banknotes in her hand and kisses her hand or something like that, and then she makes away. And that's pretty much her entire appearance in the film. But that I think
Yeah.
is her first ever appearance.
Okay, that's fascinating.
now, this is going to sound strange, but my memory of watching Lavender Hill Mob is that I find the humor, because we were talking about the kind of darkness of Kind Hearts and Coronets, and it's the black humor. I think Lavender Hill Mob is a lot more visual. It's a lot more about the city faces and the kind of the capers they the general tone of it. But the thing I remember most about it is Alec Guinness's kind of city glasses and fishy kind of face. Does that make sense to you guys?
Oh, he has got a certain element of a fish face in this particular movie. Yes.
Okay, I don't remember that, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, actually, given that we mentioned Audrey Hepburn, there was just a story regarding Audrey Hepburn in the news yesterday, because I don't know if you heard that Monsieur Givenchy has died, the head of that particular fashion house, and he made his name by making costumes for Audrey Hepburn in films. So Breakfast at Tiffany's and whatever, it was he who basically did all the styling for her. And they just had this wonderful this wonderful piece that they said when the two of them first met, he had simply been told that, oh well, yes, he was going to meet this American actress, she was called Hepburn, so he expected Katharine Hepburn. So he ended up, tailoring all these suits, thinking, "Oh well, yes, this will suit her." And then he walked in the room with this rack of clothes, and there's Audrey Hepburn, and he just looks at her, having never seen her in his life, and goes, "You're not Katharine Hepburn." At which point
I'm gonna have to take all of these colours in.
I'm Audrey Hepburn. Oh, really? Well, you might want to try these on anyway. So that was effectively the introduction to them. But it worked out okay for them, But yeah, I just found that was just a wonderful sort of introduction of this kind of, head in the clouds fashion designer who walks in, stands there in front of a Hollywood star, has no idea who she is, and the only thing he's got to say is, "You're not Katharine Hepburn."
Identify yourself, woman.
But anyway, academic, I think we've exhausted Ealing here, and you were quite keen to move on to Boulting Brothers, weren't you?
Well, I mean, only if you're happy to. Well,
yes, by all means.
I think this is quite a different cast of characters here, and again, the tone is slightly different as well. So, I've listed three here: Private's Progress from 1956. Lucky Jim from 1957, I'm All Right Jack from 1959, and then two honorary Boulting Brothers films which had neither of the Boultings actually involved in it, and that's The Naked Truth from 1957 and The School for Scoundrels from 1960. And all of these films star Peter Sellers, pre-Hollywood, Terry Thomas, also pre-Hollywood, Ian Carmichael, and Dennis Price crops up in a couple of them as well. So, yes, any thoughts about these ones?
Well, I mean, I think Terry Thomas has to rank as sort of one of the greats, doesn't he? I mean, he's up there with Alec Guinness. I don't think he's quite as famous these days, precisely because he didn't appear in Star Wars, I guess. But as such, when it comes to some kind of quintessential British comedian, I don't think you can get much better than Terry Thomas, really.
Yeah, I mean, he's got an entire way of speaking and acting that is not only hilarious but quintessentially British, or even quintessentially English, you'd say, wouldn't you?
Well, he made his mark at being the British upper crust cad. I mean, he's always got a sort of an element of a swine about him, hasn't he?
Yeah, everybody's a bounder or a swine or a shower.
Actually, yes,
Very
precisely.
thigh-slapping.
That's just it. It's the shower. In Private Progress, that film is mainly known for the fact that he plays a British officer who gives some. At one point, he, gets that irate. He gives some ordinary soldiers a total dressing down, and that's when he sort of goes on some rant and calls them all a complete shower, and it's stuck. That because that came across so brilliantly. After that, the script writers knew to include that in any sort of Terry Thomas script, and therefore, sort of "you're a complete shower" kind of became a staple of Terry Thomas.
Hilarious character.
But of course, there is also something else that Terry Thomas was very good at, and that is, you have to imagine Terry Thomas sort of accidentally stumbling across a lady with, let's say, not too much on at the time. And you know full well that he's going to smirk dirtily, and he's going to look at her, and he's definitely not going to avert his gaze. And all he's going to say is sort of to himself is, "I say,"
sort of thing.
And there is actually another actor who perfected a similar response, and that is Leslie Phillips.
Right.
Yeah, ding,
But
ding dong.
With Leslie Phillips, it wasn't "I say." With him, it was "ding dong." And the beauty of those two sort of types of responses is they mean nothing. They're completely meaningless. And yet everybody knows what they mean. And that's, I think that's sort of a beauty of what those two actors managed to tickle out of nothingness. They managed to create something out of thin air there, that everybody kind of chuckled along with the sort of almost implied dirtiness that was never there. And,
but it's also very, it is an implied dirtiness, but it's also in a way very gentle.
yes.
I mean, I could have, like you say, Terry Thomas, he sees a lady in a river who's washing her knickers or whatever, and he says, "I say," and he slaps his thighs and all of that. But that he's just gonna go home and drink a nice scotch and maybe think about it and laugh about it. That's it.
Yeah. But as I say, you have to remember that this is, of course, the era of the blue pen, when effectively, censorship was something
right.
Real. One had to find one's way around the censorship authorities, and in a strange way, once, in a way, censorship was loosened, that was, in a way, the death of these comedies. I mean, that's why sort of somewhere in the 70s they all died. Because
you're absolutely right.
When it was no longer about, implication and coming up with creative ways of doing that, it lost its magic. Because if you just showed people what previously you implied, you weren't, in a way, operating on the same level anymore. It wasn't a nudge and a wink anymore.
You're absolutely right. That's why Carry On ended up with Carry On Emmanuel.
Yes, and in doing so, it completely lost its innocence, and it was no longer charming.
Right. I think you're right. I agree.
There's a bit more. I would say there's a bit more to the Terry Thomas character, though, because he also has this sense that the entire world is like collapsing around him, and he's just kind of dealing with it with a kind of bad headache or something. There's a kind of there's a certain fed upness to the character as well.
Yes, I mean he did have multiple layers. He it wasn't just one personality. Yes, and in Private's Progress, isn't there that one moment where he has been out on the night? I mean, he's been out for the night. He's really got drunk. And so too the Ian Carmichael character, who is the ordinary soldier.
Yeah.
So the Terry Thomas's officer, he's got completely plastered. And so has the soldier, but obviously in separate parts of town. And now the soldier is brought before him the next day. And he is supposed to kind of, deal with a reprobate, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he is there with Alka-Seltzers in a glass of water, while the sergeant is stamping around, and reporting exactly what this soldier did wrong yesterday and how he came back to barracks drunk. And you've just got him sort of, wincing with every word and looking at this poor chap going, oh, what am I supposed to do with him? And then he gives him some brief sentence that he'll have to do, fatigues or whatever, a day or two. And then as they're about to turn, the corporals and the sergeants are about to turn away and march this soldier out of the room, he just goes, just a moment. And he just reaches into his little packet and hands Ian Carmichael 2 Alka-Seltzers and just go, just dissolve them with a glass of water, old chap. Have a nice day. And it's just that sort of adds that beautiful personal touch, which in that regard, yes, Terry Thomas was just perfect at.
Yeah, whereas the Leslie Nielsen character is just a bit more of a sleazeball, or a bit more of there's a bit more of sliminess to that character as he crops up. Sorry, Leslie Phillips. Yeah, Leslie Phillips.
Can you guys identify the film where I wanted to say it's King Rat, but I'm sure it's not. But I seem to remember it's Terry Thomas, and he's a prisoner of war, and he's an officer, and they're in dire straits in a prisoner of war camp. And there's a moment where he gets a cigarette. He makes a cigarette out of old cigarette ends, and he makes a cigarette and he puts it at the end of his cigarette holder. And someone, I think it's the quartermaster, looks at him and he says, "Oh, it's the only way I can enjoy it." And I just think it's stuff like that. I mean, it's this kind of understatement that he was so good at, and this comic timing.
I can't identify that film, I'm afraid, but it definitely sounds like him. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for all I know, it's I'm remembering it wrong, and it's several different films combined in my mind. But that to me is who Terry Thomas is. This very kind of, well, as you were saying, Britisher, this very kind of understated sort of upper class chap.
Yeah,
who you probably could have a nice gin and tonic with.
But there is a beautiful twist, of course, to Terry Thomas, and that is in real life, he wasn't posh. He was actually the son of a butcher.
Right.
But yes,
I didn't know that.
He had managed to acquire this beautiful kind of multi-layered posh persona where it was so real that you were certain that he must have been to Eton and gone to a posh university and know the right people, so to speak. But everything of it was an act.
Like Roger Moore.
I didn't know that. Roger Moore again was he common as muck, was he?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but he was the son of a policeman.
Oh well, yeah.
And I've heard him talking about his dad, and he says, "Oh, and my dad used to talk like that, kind of a bit London sort of thing." And yeah, I love the idea that he had he had a very normal sort of upbringing. He wasn't posh, but he also did own a monkey as a child, so that's not common.
Yeah, one thing I did want to say is that I do like the fact that Terry Thomas reprises. Isn't he the same character in I'm All Right, Jack as he is in Private's Progress? It's completely different setting, but it's the same guy, isn't it? Like, I think the idea is that after he left the army, he then went to run this factory in I'm All Right, Jack. So that's a nice bit of continuity in those two films.
In that regard, the title applies as much to him as it does to everybody else. I'm all right, Jack. That it's not just the unions that are just looking out for themselves and whatever. It is also the management that is, personified by Terry Thomas. That look, as long as I'm fine, then that's okay
Yes.
with me.
And the Alka-Seltzers also make a reappearance in that as well. Because he's just had this terrible meeting with one of the union bosses, and he's dealing with a headache, and then somebody else comes in, and he's like, I do like him in that film as well.
I think, is it fair to say that of all these early British films that we're talking about, I'm All Right, Jack is more than likely your most favourite?
I do like Kind Hearts and Coronets as well,
Yeah.
because of the iciness of the Dennis Price
of it. Yes.
Vicious. I mean, I tend towards darkness, and I just like how cold and calculating the Dennis Price character is. Like, he's got a plan, he executes it.
It's like watching The Talented Mr. Ripley, but in the 1800s.
Yeah, that's very well put. Yes, actually.
The whole tone of it. I mean, that the Kind Hearts and Coronets was 6 in the BFI 100. And if I was to make a theoretical top 100 British comedies list, or top 50, that probably Kind Hearts and Coronets is looking towards the top spot. But I'm All Right, Jack is up there as well. Incidentally, that was number 47 on the BFI 100. A little bit low for my tastes. Right above Nicholas Rogue's performance, incidentally.
I think with Terry Thomas, he's pretty much in most of the things that are Boulting Brothers movies, or that we would identify as Boulting Brothers movies.
Yes,
we had an exchange before we came on air whereby we're not sure whether all the things that we deem Boulting Brothers movies are in fact Boulting Brothers movies.
Well, yeah, School for Scoundrels is
the realm of the technical, aren't we?
School for Scoundrels is not one. And neither is The Naked Truth, which we both watched in preparation for this.
Well, you watched The Naked Truth, so I sort of thought, well, if you're watching The Naked Truth, I best do so too. I haven't watched The School for Scoundrels in preparation for this, but I am very familiar with that film because I absolutely adore it. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, and that's another. I mean, we should talk a little bit about the Ian Carmichael character, because he specializes in what would you call him, a naif, a kind of like a kind of innocent everyman.
Yes, precisely. I think he is the innocent everyman. I think that's perfectly put. He's, in a way, he's sort of the comedy version, the British comedy version of a Jimmy Stewart, if you know what I mean. That he is the nice chap. He's perhaps got a certain naivete about himself. He is the one with whom we side, but he also has limitations. He's kind of struggling and straining, and he may himself also have his own little vanities and whatever. But yes, I've once read in one critique people were calling him insipid, but I find that very unfair. I think he was very good at what he did, and that character was kind of necessary for those films. So you can have the kind of cynical Terry Thomas character, but you need someone to be his foil. And therefore, you need someone who is the nice one. And it's very easy then to deride that one as, oh, well, that's nothing special. But he is, in a way, the one who makes Terry Thomas shine.
Yes, I'd certainly agree with that. Now, there's another person in these films who we probably should mention too, and that is Peter Sellers.
Peter Sellers.
Yeah. Essentially, what happened, from what I can gather, is that both Terry Thomas and Peter Sellers were snapped up by Hollywood, which is why these films basically end in 1960, because they both spent the 60s making. I mean, I haven't actually seen them, but Terry Thomas appears in these films that, for all intents and purposes, look like a live version of Wacky Races. Have you seen any of those Hollywood films that you made? I'm thinking of, for example,
the one with the big W.
Yeah. So there's the it's a mad world.
Oh, I remember that. Yes.
The one I'm thinking of, those magnificent men in their flying machines.
That is a magnificent film. I love that one.
Is that the one with the guy going around saying a German officer can do anything?
That's with Gerd Fröbe. Gerd Fröbe is the one who played Henrique Goldfinger in James Bond.
Yeah, I think the setup is that people come from all over the world to
precisely, and
have a kind of race in wacky flying machines.
Of course, the inimitable Robert Morley, who plays the British newspaper tycoon, who basically announces the contest. And once he has announced the contest, then from all over the world. So I think he announces a race from London to Paris in aeroplanes.
Right.
And he makes it quite clear to his potential son-in-law, who is a British officer, that he expects a Briton to win the race. Preferably
and it's an American, right?
Sorry?
It's an American who wins, isn't it?
No, I think it actually is the Briton who wins, because the American pulls back at the last moment to save. Is it the Frenchman? I'm not sure. I think it might. No, I think it was the Italian. That basically the three of them are over Paris heading towards the airfield, and the Italian gets into trouble. So the American kind of pulls back from contention in order to save the Italian. The Briton, who isn't aware of the trouble behind him because he's in the lead, he finishes first. But then on hearing what had happened, he then agrees to share the winnings with the American. So in a way, they both win.
I see.
Because, well, yes, I mean, it's, you've got all these British actors, but one needs the American market, and one can't possibly have the American coming in second now, can one?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm thinking. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia page where it's a mad world, and the cast in that is extraordinary.
I think this is essentially what Terry Thomas did. He appeared in there's one film that I haven't seen called Tom Thumb, which was both Sellers and Terry Thomas. But again, it's almost like they got into a groove of making those films like 80 Days Around the World, where it's kind of like a very all-star. Yeah, it's a caper with a huge all-star cast, and you kind of spot the star type thing. And it seems like Terry Thomas did a lot of those when he.
Well, I think in that regard, you have to look at those caper films as the equivalent of the superhero films today, where basically that was where the money was. And with them being big names, they were kind of, drafted in, so to speak.
Right,
so,
yeah.
They were the kind of Patrick Stewarts and Ian McKellens of the X-Men.
Yeah, getting Terry Thomas was a bit like, getting Patrick Stewart to do a bit in your film or something.
Yes, precisely.
Or Lawrence Fishburne or someone. I agree. It is interesting to look at those parallels, because I was thinking about Terry Thomas, and I was thinking, I think it would be very hard for someone who adopted the same sort of persona as Terry Thomas to come up to the very top of film now. That it would be more of a bit, wouldn't it?
I think the closest thing we would get to that these days would be someone like Stephen Fry.
Right, yeah, who's kind of famous for being him, and people see him in a film and they go, "Oh, it's Stephen Fry, great, I like him."
Yeah, but I know what you mean. I think what it was is that Britain made almost a conscious attempt at trying to kill off the kind of upper class twit. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I mean, for a while there was this story that went round that P.G. Wodehouse wasn't given a knighthood because of his supposed collaboration with the Nazis, but that actually turned out to be a red herring. It wasn't true. That the government would have actually been willing to give P.G. Wodehouse a knighthood long before they did. But the reason it was so long delayed is because the British government were afraid that it would yet further reinforce an opinion of the British abroad as these kind of upper class twits. because of course P.G. Wodehouse so famously was Jeeves and Wooster, and his creations were all these kind of posh upper class British idiots. And
That's
the
interesting.
British government was so conscious of wanting to get away from that they would actually not give this writer, for of whom they thought that he was well deserving of a knighthood, they wouldn't give him a knighthood because they felt this would be politically inopportune.
He's the wrong sort of person.
Yeah, but it kind of shows that there was almost a conscious move away from, we must get away from these Terry Thomas types because we no longer want to be seen like that, because it reminds everyone of our past and our empire and whatever. Whereas we want to be seen as, to coin a phrase, cool Britannia. But that was back in the 60s and 70s,
That's amazing. I mean, surely that that didn't work. I think around the world people do have. I don't think everyone thinks, oh, Britain is full of upper class twits, but I think especially in America, we're viewed as being very quaint.
Yeah, but I think
Mm.
in a way it was almost a kind of hang up by British society itself, that it was afraid of being seen in that way.
Yeah.
Whether it was actually seen by the rest of the world that way was another matter, but it was the one thing that obsessed them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, my dad went to Czechoslovakia in the 70s, and the story I think he was camping or something, and the story he tells is no one could believe that you could get shaving foam out of a can, is the first thing. But he had several people come up to him and say, oh, you're British, and they got talking to him. And apparently people would say, and does everyone wear bowler hats in Britain?
Yeah.
And in the 70s, at least people in Czechoslovakia had this image of everyone in Britain, dressed like a banker,
Yep.
from the 1920s. I find that fascinating.
Nowadays, the only person still to wear a bowler hat in London is Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Right. Or
Yes.
people who are doing like a street performance. It's very very few people do it seriously, do they?
But actually, when you mentioned Czechoslovakia, I'm kind of reminded of what I heard once. I think I might have actually seen it on sort of the extras on the DVD of Amadeus, because of course they went to Czechoslovakia to film that movie because they wanted the Prague streets, because there was so little modernity in the streets.
Right.
So they could kind of much more easily create an impression of the past. So much more easy to do 18th century Vienna in Prague. But at the time of them making it, it was of course behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
So with the American film crew, everyone was kind of wondering, which one of us is CIA?
Yeah, all of us.
And of course, with all the minders that were with them, everyone was absolutely convinced that most of them were more than likely KGB or something like that.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
One of the actors was then asked by some people in New York or whatever, oh, well, if you're going over there, we still have some relatives in Prague. Can you take some things for them?
Is this the story about the shower?
No. This is about the fruit, because to his surprise, he was asked to basically take a basket of fruit because it was almost unobtainable. So as you said, shaving cream in a can, the same thing with fresh fruit. So he arrived, and these so these relatives arrived on the set, and he handed them the fruit. And of course, he said no sooner were they gone, one of these minders turns up, with in ultimate sleaze. Ah, I see you have made friends, and he was there, and he just sort of, his skin crawled as this guy talked to him, and so it was clear the guy wanted to know, what have you just handed over?
Yeah.
And he just said, oh, well, no, I've just brought some fresh fruit. I was asked by some relatives in America to bring them some fruit. He said, oh, so what was it? So he said, oh, well, oranges. And already he could see this guy's eyes light up. I said, oranges? Impossible. And he goes on, oranges, grapefruit, whatever. And then he finishes with saying, oh, yes, and a pineapple. pineapple. Oh, you mean a can? And with his hands, he made sort of a sign, as in like a can. And the actor just went, no, no, and made the big sign, as in, no, a pineapple. And the guy almost fainted. The idea of a real pineapple in Prague at that time, at that time was just unthinkable.
Oh dear. So that's what communism is good for, making film sets.
Precisely. So he then basically sat back and then watched how all the minders around the entire film set repeated the same hand gestures. Oh, well, you mean a can? No, a pineapple. And it just went round, and they just couldn't, no one could believe it. So in just the same way that nobody could believe that shaving cream came out of a can, nobody believed that it was possible to have a fresh pineapple in Prague at the time of the making of Amadeus.
That's fantastic.
Sorry, I've gone completely berserk now. We are about as far away from Boulting Brothers films as we could absolutely get.
One thing I was going to say is that the thing you were saying about the trying to get away from British stereotypes, which has obviously failed dismally, is I recently read Peter Hitchens's extraordinarily grumpy book, The Abolition of Britain. I don't know if either of you have read that.
But you've advised me to read it, but I've not found the time yet. But
yeah, so
please go on.
one of his core ideas in that book is that basically all of these comedy films and the British middle class lampooned the aristocracy and lampooned the British institutions to such an extent that they could no longer be taken seriously. So the very idea of the bowler hat wearer, for example, or that image, I'm picturing like John Cleese doing a silly walk down the street. It was lampooned so successfully and so thoroughly that there was no possible way of going back to it in the popular consciousness. And I mean, he's very conservative, so he sees this as a tremendous loss. But it is quite an interesting thing to consider exactly when that started happening.
So basically what you're saying is they that successfully lampooned authority that effectively any authority within society became almost impossible to enforce, because the moment you try to do so, you became that character.
Exactly right. And what he talks about is a watershed moment when I think it was on the Frost Report. There was that precursor TV comedy that David Frost fronted that I've only ever seen clip because I don't think full episodes of it exist, but it was very popular at the time. When they started making fun of the sacred cow that was the Second World War, and it was less than kind of 20 years past the, I think it was only like 15 years had passed since the end of World War II. But now they started to make fun of this because, his whole thesis is that the intellectual class had always been squeamish about being proud of British things, and also squeamish even about, the kind of national unity that came from the Second World War. And so once you'd made fun of that, basically all the gloves were off, and there was essentially nothing in society was sacred anymore.
You lost any kind of unifying element.
Exactly. That's not his only idea, but it's one of his core ideas in that book. And I thought it was just an interesting thing, because when we look at these, especially the Boulting Brothers films, they are really attacking. I don't know if they're attacking, but they're poking fun of the institutions all throughout British society.
I get the sense with all of these films, though, not just the Boulting Brothers. I think with the Ealing Comedies, there's a fair bit of that. Do you think?
Well, yes.
Yeah. You see, I've always thought this about the how can I say? The band The Kinks, the British band. They've got albums like Village Green and Arthur or the decline and fall of the British Empire, that there's this kind of fondness for the thing that you're commenting on, a kind of
Sure.
inbuilt nostalgia and almost sentimentality about it. So I don't think that these films are intentionally trying to attack the institute,
No.
or they're not against them. They're kind of just
No, they're-
gently and fondly making, drawing
You're
attention to some of
absolutely
the
right.
absurdities.
Are either of you familiar with the film Carlton Brown of the FO?
No.
Because that's where Terry Thomas plays. He plays the kind of, obviously, once again, the upper class twit at the Foreign Office, hence FO. But he's kind of in charge of miscellaneous territories, which basically is, should anything come up that doesn't really concern a real nation, but some obscure island in the Pacific, then it falls under the aegis of miscellaneous territories, and it comes to Terry Thomas. And of course, on some tiny little island, some international crisis arises. So then suddenly the Soviets are there, the Russians are there, the French are there, every world power is there. And who has to deal with it? Terry Thomas.
Sounds amazing.
It does sound good, doesn't it?
And once again, then you have in a way an illustration of the old-fashioned British way of doing things simply no longer being up to it. So there he is he's basically sent out there as the ambassador. So he arrives there in his white outfit with his pith helmet with the feathers on. I mean, so the old-fashioned garb of an ambassador or territorial governor. And he's there supposed to deal with, modern nuclear powers on this island, and there was no better illustration in a way of showing, well, yeah, perhaps the British are sort of past their best. That seemed to be, in pictures at least, the message that film was kind of sending.
And how much of this do you think is Britain dealing with, Suez and loss of empire, loss of position in the world? We talked before, didn't we, about the humiliation of Keynes and that when he went over to Washington to beg. And
I think when it comes to that, yes, that obviously is there is the problem of how does Britain come to terms with it, but in a charming way, the British came to terms with it with humor. It is just, as you would say, Hitchens points out, the humor may have then actually only contributed yet further to the very decline that they were actually making fun about.
Yes. But I think it's less intentionally subversive than he makes it sound. I actually think
a natural thing.
I think it's just an unfortunate side product of what these guys were actually. I don't get the impression that any of these films hate their subjects, if that makes any sense.
Yes. No, I know exactly what you mean. That there is a sort of a fondness. Yeah, there's a liking or almost an admiration for the thing one is poking fun at.
Yes.
Actually, while we're at this, because I know that you're desperate, you are keen to kind of talk about this particular character, and I think we are very much in this sphere, because there is an actor called David Tomlinson.
Who
you have a particular fondness for, and I think this may be an opportune moment to kind of thread him into the conversation.
Yeah. So
brilliant.
One thing I'll say is that I love David Tomlinson so much that when I was making my channel, I toyed with having him as my avatar rather than George Sanders. And in fact, the reason I didn't do it is that because I am known to love him so much, I thought it would be too obvious for anybody who actually knew me. If they came across this and he was my avatar, they'd be like, "Yeah, that's obviously like an immediate dox type thing." I really do like this actor a lot, and again, he has got that kind of. In fact, Mary Poppins in general is an interesting film to talk about with regard to this. It's a kind of it's a nostalgia for a past that none of us actually experienced. Does that make any sense?
Yes, very much
Yes.
so. Yeah.
And I think that it runs through a lot of British stuff after the war. The Kinks have it as well. You know, they're talking about the village green, but is it a kind of constructed, romanticized, slightly hazy, romantic past as opposed to something that you actually remember? You know, it's
yes,
almost
is,
that
yeah.
we're talking about, just kind of, yeah.
Well, the closest thing I could kind of compare what you're talking about here to is Christmas, where somehow we've all got some kind of Victorian ideal in our minds, which, as you say, we've never experienced because we never lived in that time period.
Well, so what I'll say about David Tomlinson is that he made his name in comedies in the 50s, but not in particularly good ones, and not in. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Tomlinson pre-Disney. Have either of you seen it? Because I haven't, and I'm one of his biggest fans.
I could well imagine I've seen him in bit parts and things
There's
in
like
films.
three. What's that one called? There's three of them, and they're on a ship. It's called. I'm trying to remember now. But yeah, he basically specialized in I guess these upper class twit type characters, or the silly ass type characters in the mid
The
50s.
authority figure who comes apart. Yes.
But I really think he probably comes into his own in his Disney run, and in The Love Bug, and in Bed Knobs and Broomsticks.
Oh yes, I forgot. Yes, Herbie, the love bug. Yes, he was the villain, wasn't he? Who was always driving Jags.
One of the things that I especially love the Mr. Banks character and how he plays it, and it's always been one of my dreams to be just like Mr. Banks in my own life, but not kind of Mr. Banks at the end where he's, let's go fly a kite. That's
yes, but the restrained, the stiff upper lip.
You
Mr.
want
Banks.
to be the mean Mr. Banks.
I want to be Mr. Banks near the start of the film.
You want a sea captain shouting "Banks" to you from a rooftop.
I mean, one of my favorite things is that he's striding around singing this song. 601, I march through my door. What does he say? My
year
slippers,
is 1910. Yeah, sorry.
My slippers pipe, and his wife is trying to tell him that the kids are gone.
Yes.
And he's like, yes, and then he carries on. He gets all the way, he gets to the final flourish, and then he just turns around and says, "Winifred, where are the children?" And it's only on his own terms that he's, that's what I love about that character.
Well, as I say, it needn't be a sea captain shouting Banks living next door. It could be a British officer in a pith helmet with two sepoys on the roof,
yes,
firing artillery shells into the distance, and then I can just turn around once in a while and go Banks.
There's another wonderful moment in that film as well where he says, "And one thing more, when I sit down at an instrument, I expect it to be in tune." And then she says, "But George, you don't play." "Madam, that is entirely beside the point." It's just a kind of wonderful encapsulation of one. In fact, if I was making an all-time best films ever, I think there's something about Poppins in general that is kind of picture perfect. It's not even a British film, but it's a very British film.
Object here that there is something that I think supersedes Mary Poppins in that regard. Again, as you say, it's not a British film, although it drips Britishness, and that is My Fair Lady.
Yeah,
because I think Professor Higgins, in that regard, even tops Mr. Banks. I think Professor Higgins, when she is whining and caterwauling at the beginning, and he just looks at her and goes, "Woman, will you stop this infernal boo-hooing?" And then he does that song, doesn't he? Why can't the English learn to speak?
Yeah.
He's talking about the various accents, and then he does that little aside about, don't talk about the bloody Americans. It's just. So I think Professor Higgins is close to where you want to be with Mr. Banks, but I think he might actually he might have one up on him there, to be honest.
There's something about that kind of I don't know. I don't even know what the word what would you call it? A kind of diffidence, a kind of not a kind of nonchalance about the world around you, and a what was the word? A self-assurance, right?
Self-assurance. He's got the weight of the empire behind him, hasn't he? You know, railways in Africa. He really believes it.
That's exactly.
I think the word we might be looking for, to a degree, not entirely, but to a degree, is curmudgeon.
It's a curmudgeonliness, but mixed with a certain imperiousness, I would say.
But can I suggest an actor who made made an art form of the curmudgeonliness with a certain imperiousness? Maybe once you see the picture, you will know of what I speak. And that is we've got blinking. I have no idea why it's no, we've got, so basically James Robertson Justice is to my mind the almost perfect personification of that side of things. He did curmudgeonliness and grumpiness, and I don't care what the rest of the world thinks of me. Better, I think, almost than anybody else.
What would you recommend of his British show?
Well, he did Doctor in the House with what was he called? Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde is a young doctor who is at medical school, and James Robertson Justice is the chief surgeon, who basically sweeps through the hospital, and just bosses people around. And he also played this sort of wealthy house owner in the first Miss Marple film, Murder She Said. And in both those particular films, he is magnificent in just his grumpiness and his just basically, I don't care. I want my tea now, and I want it the way I want it, not the way you wish to serve it to me.
Yes,
that kind of thing.
This is exactly what we're getting towards. Yeah, I do. There's a particular character that we're talking about here, and they're all captured. The Rex Harrison character, the David Tomlinson one, this one. What about David Niven in this regard? Do you think he's got a bit more of a? He's a bit more carefree, isn't he, in general?
He's kind of in the Leslie Phillips streak, isn't he?
Yes, I mean, he's much more light-hearted.
Yeah.
In that regard, he's more gentlemanly. He will actually defer to the lady, whereas the Rex Harrison or James Robertson Justice, they will just bawl at them and go, "Do what I say."
Yeah, almost like Leslie Phillips is like a caricature of an English aristocrat, and I could imagine David Niven actually being one.
Actually, with David Niven, of course, there is a question of how much of that was actual reality, because he did, I think, one or two presentations where he was the host at the Oscars. This was, of course, before the Oscars became quite as overblown as they are now.
Right.
And therefore, Niven was the presenter at the Oscars when I think their only ever streaker occurred. So
really? Okay.
Yeah, so he's on stage and this streaker goes by, and then so basically there's some kerfuffle, the audience react, this streaker goes by, then several security guards go by, then armed men go by and whatever, and David Niven just adjusts his cuffs, doesn't react at all for a while, and then just turns to the microphone and goes, "What for an awful lot of kerfuffle for such a little thing," and then just continues with the show. And it was just magnificent. But it kind of showed that he was almost in character. And therefore you wonder, well, was that actually him? As opposed to him just, playing a role. If you can, in a crisis situation like that, just react so bone dry, then that more than likely must be a substantial part of you.
What I like about this is that you have a kind of basic we have a kind of basic type here, and you tweak it in certain ways, and you come out with these different. So I'm just thinking you can take this basic type that we're talking about here, just tweak it a little bit, and you just make it a bit more sinister, and you end up with the Dennis Price character, don't you? It's kind of like
they're
it's
different
interesting the way
flavors. They're different flavors of the same thing, really. Yes, I agree with you there. That you basically have a sort of standard well-to-do British gentleman, but you can give it different twists, and you can come up with an absolute arch villain like Dennis Price, a twit like Terry Thomas, or yes, sort of the ultimate restrained gent like David Niven.
Well, do we want to? I've lost my list here.
Well, actually, we were still on Boulting Brothers, weren't we? So
we should talk about Peter Sellers, I think, because I mean, I think there's a direct. He's pretty much the heir to the Alec Guinness playing many different roles thing, isn't
precisely.
he? But would you agree that he is better than Alec Guinness at playing the many different roles in one film?
Yes.
Again, yes, I would agree. Yes.
Because
I would agree, but I don't think it means he's necessarily a better actor. I think they're both very good actors. I just think that Peter Sellers had a real knack of getting a character right.
And he has the advantage, of course, of the he's the man of many accents, isn't he? He can do.
Yes.
He's got like a Scottish and an Irish and in fact that film we watched the other night, British The Naked Truth.
Actually, yes, you just made me laugh there because you reminded me when you said the Irish accent, because that one was where he goes into an Irish pub and he tries to basically unveil himself with the Irish. And there's just these two hard Irish chaps sitting there playing chess with each other or whatever they do. And he sits down between them and tries to blend in and speak Irish with them as though he's, direct from the old country. And these two Irishmen don't say a word. They just look at him, and he realizes he's getting himself in ever deeper and deeper, but he carries on regardless. Until eventually one Irishman just responds with a thundering punch to his face. It's just so basically the message was quite simple. You can fool an Englishman with a fake Irish accent, but don't try it with an Irishman.
There's a wonderful thing in that whole film, actually, the Naked Truth, which is all of these kind of middle class and upper class characters just kind of blithely assuming that they can wander into the underworld and have their way, and it's the kind of their perception versus the reality of actually being there.
Yes,
all of these people kind of in the underside of life are just, they're not having any of their shit at all. It's kind of pretty, like, none of their schemes come to.
Mind you, in The Naked Truth, how much do you think particularly towards the end, when Dennis Price is basically at their mercy, how much do you think of that glee actually came from people in the film industry wanting to have someone from the tabloid newspapers at their mercy in that manner? There was a certain element of wish fulfillment there, wasn't there?
It's a very. Have you seen that one, George?
No.
It's a very interesting.
I have. I do know what you're talking about, but not for a long time.
It's an interesting film because he's just he's a blackmailer, essentially, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah. Basically, he's a member of the press who digs up dirt on people, but realizes that it's more lucrative to blackmail people with it. To basically say, I will put it in the newspaper unless you pay me, rather than just by making money from publishing it.
What's genuinely interesting about that film is that obviously he's a terrible person, this blackmailer. He's truly villainous. He is completely, amoral, shows no remorse at all. But everybody in the film is also kind of, by the very fact that they're being blackmailed, morally compromised.
Yeah.
And it's the lengths that they will go to. Don't forget, they all had to plot to kill this man. So it's like that, we're dealing with characters who are prepared to kill to preserve their reputations,
Their reputation.
and their reputation is only threatened by the fact that they've already done something wrong. So there's a kind of interesting, I guess, tragic vision of life there, where everybody is morally compromised in some way.
Well, there is one beautiful thing about the Dennis Price character that I think says quite a lot, even to people who haven't seen the movie, and that is that you have to imagine that at the beginning of the movie, when they're kind of introducing him and showing what he's up to, you see him, in a kind of summary, where there's not necessarily any words, kind of dealing with some of his victims. So at one point, he gets led out the house after he's just visited one of his latest blackmail victims, and as the other person is then turning to go back in, he holds out his hand as if to shake their hand, and they just look at it in sort of disdain, turn around and slam the door in his face. And he just reacts, with a kind of raised eyebrow, which kind of suggests, well, I might be your blackmailer, but there's no reason not to be civil. and that is him in a nutshell in that movie. That he's utterly villainous, but hey, I mean, one can still observe the decencies.
On the Peter Sellers point, the one thing I do want to mention before I forget is I actually think his performance in I'm Alright Jack is really very well observed. I mean, he gets that kind of petty union representative who's read a little bit of Marx, who has, I guess, pretensions to, like, he obviously thinks in his own mind he wants to be an intellectual, but he obviously hasn't read enough, and
he sounds like an absolutely credible union representative.
I mean,
there is something about the tone and the vocabulary and just the way he basically handles himself that is utterly believable, and you have seen that character before. Basically, that at some old Labour Party conferences or whatever, you have heard that person speak and sound exactly like that.
It's for my money, it's one of the most, I guess, one of the best observed comic performances I can think of in any film.
I would wholeheartedly agree there. It is extremely well observed. Anybody who has ever come across, whether it's in person or on television, a person like that will immediately recognize it in Peter Sellers' performance. It really is quite stellar. Since we're on Boulting Brothers, as I say, we weren't really sure whether this is one or not, but School for Scoundrels, I think we must mention, whether it is a Boulting Brothers film or not. I mean, we agree it involves the same.
It basically is, for all intents and purposes.
So it's got Ian Carmichael, it's got Terry Thomas, and of course it's got the immortal Alistair Sim.
Yes.
School for Scoundrels really is something special. When I entered, when I was looking for illustrations and things like that, and I entered School for Scoundrels, I lost the will to live because it appears there is some recent American version of School for Scoundrels.
Who's made about 10 years ago, right?
That just basically, it just, my heart sunk. I don't even want to try and watch it.
I'm going to see who's in that new remake.
Because it was just one of those things where you just go, no, I'm sorry, but here you now are messing with perfection.
Bob Thornton.
Yes,
Very
Billy Bob
strange.
Thornton. Yes,
right.
I'm assuming he's the Alistair Sim character. I don't know. I'm guessing.
Ben Stiller as well. That's funny.
But when you watch School for Scoundrels, I'm sorry, you are looking at perfection. As far as I'm concerned, that really is one of the perfect films of that particular era.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
It's got everything. It's got Ian Carmichael as the sort of the hero who's kind of, he's a bit of a trier, but he always loses. You've got Alistair Sim as the what is that school called he runs? The School for Lifemanship, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that what he calls it?
Yeah, school for life
And effectively, what he teaches people is how to cheat. Basically, this is how to win in any aspect of life, whether it's getting on in business, whether it's, getting the woman, no matter what it is, there is a method. If you studied at the School of Lifemanship, we'll teach you all the tricks. You will be a winner. And he basically, so here is Ian Carmichael, this kind of meek, kind of loser, so to speak, who then goes to the School for Lifemanship and just becomes an absolute master of the craft. And the person who has, at the beginning of the film, kind of, humiliated him and rubbed his face in it, who is the Terry Thomas character, then just gets paired like a chicken by Ian Carmichael at the end of the movie.
So funny.
And it is something to behold. I mean, I would challenge anybody to watch that film for the first time and not to be hollering with laughter, particularly towards the end when he is just, I mean, he's dissecting Terry Thomas.
I think we should run it and the 2006 version side by side and see if they've done it justice. Well, because I was thinking when you were saying that, he runs a school telling people how to get ahead in life. Obviously, 2006 is too early, but I was thinking if they did that now, it would be the person doing that would be someone on a YouTube advert saying, "Hi, I'm just making this video from my garage with my Lamborghini in my massive house. Just click on the link below."
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
No, I really think that is one of the great. It reminded me, seeing that they'd made a remake of School for Scoundrels, reminded me of when I not too long ago saw that they'd made a remake for Ben-Hur. There are certain films that, I'm sorry folks, they're already as good as they're going to get. Why are you remaking them?
Yeah, you just think, just don't touch it. Just don't touch it because you can't live up to the expectations.
Yeah,
you're just shooting yourself in the foot by remaking Ben-Hur.
Yeah, because you are really sort of playing around with something that is basically as good as you could possibly make it. Incidentally, I don't know, because we had technical problems just before when I try to screen share something, so I don't know whether this will work or not. I'll give it a go anyhow. So we've got here Hugh Griffith, who he appeared in my favorite Ealing comedy, which is the Titfield Thunderbolt. But most people would more than likely recognize him from being in Ben-Hur. Because, when you see him like this, Hugh Griffith, you sort of think, well, hang on, he's some kind of Welshman. What connection has he got? Well, with a lot of shoe polish, you can turn him into the Arab whose white horses power Charlton Heston's chariot in the circus. He played the Arab.
Mm.
But in the Ealing comedy, he actually plays the ex railwayman who helps them in the Titfield Thunderbolt run the locomotive. That's my favorite Ealing comedy. I know we've already skipped on to Boulting, but that's the one that I rate above all the others in the Ealing comedies, when some little town loses its railway connection. So they decide, well, we can run the railway service ourselves. So obviously the authorities are putting everything in their way that they possibly can. And they're sort of trying to make do. So obviously they're having some kind of retired railwayman in the vicinity who knows how to run a locomotive is of some help to them. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here again, aren't I?
Well, one thing I was going to say on the School for Scoundrels is that it's there's a particular genre of, it's not really a genre, but there is something that I like, and this is, I guess, goes back to my love of darkness, I guess. But I like films that are basically a duel of wits between two characters, which obviously the School for Scoundrel is. I mean, it's a duel between the Ian Carmichael character and the Terry Thomas character, right? But that, I mean, I kind of like, there are other films that are essentially just that. It's kind of game theory writ large. I don't know if either of you ever seen Sleuth with Michael Caine and
Yes.
Lawrence
Oh
Olivier.
yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I love that.
And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is essentially the same between the husband and the wife. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, and
War of the Roses.
War of the Roses is one. In a way, also I would look at something like
The Odd Couple with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon.
You know, I was thinking about that as well.
what's that one from the 80s with Michael Caine in it? Is it Dirty Rotten Scoundrels?
Dirty
yes,
Rotten Scoundrels,
yes,
where
yes.
they do the whole wheelchair thing.
Yes.
I mean, all of these are essentially kind of duel of wit, like a duel of wills, I guess. There's one with that I guess more serious is Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, where it's Bowie versus the Japanese prisoner of war officer. I kind of love, he ends up breaking his will at the end. I don't know. There's something about that storyline that particularly appeals to me. So I wanted to mention that.
Well, given we're talking sort of Boulting Brothers films, are any? I mean, this is an obscure one. You'll forgive me. Are either of you familiar with Brothers-in-Law? Because
I haven't seen it. No.
That's a Boulting Brothers movie, and that actually stars Richard Attenborough.
Richard Attenborough, right? Yeah.
And it also has a Terry Thomas appearance in it. But Terry Thomas, I think this is one of sort of his earlier ones. And here he doesn't get to play the posh chap. In fact, in this particular case, he gets to play the East End rogue.
Oh, interesting.
The basic story in this film is that Ian Carmichael is the kind of the chap who's basically just passed his legal exam, and he's kind of trying to become a lawyer. So he kind of has to piggyback on some kind of legal office in London. And they kind of give him their scraps, if you know what I mean. And he has absolutely no idea. I mean, in his first case, he gets lumbered with it because the lawyer who is actually doing the case has to leave for another courtroom where, some other judge is demanding something. So it gets dropped in his lap, and he has no idea. He's only just walked in 30 seconds ago. So he ends up sort of standing there with I think it might be John Le Mesurier staring at him as the judge, as in, well, and he's there looking around helplessly, and he turns to the opposition lawyer and goes, "Which side am I on?" He doesn't even know whether he's the defense or the prosecutor. So that's the sort of tone of this whole thing. But the first case he ever wins is the one with Terry Thomas, because the Terry Thomas character is a complete rogue who basically does some kind of postal scam, but he knows his legal situation. So basically he's got it in the small print, so no one can touch him. So the reason Ian Carmichael wins the case is because Terry Thomas is effectively telling him what to do. And it's got some beautiful little scenes in where, as this junior lawyer, he ends up playing golf with some other lawyers and judges. And of course, he's paired once again with John Le Mesurier. And whereas John Le Mesurier can play, he's constantly getting it wrong. And, so basically the two of them are supposed to be playing as a team, and he's always wrecking the chances of this judge, which I think you can imagine doesn't go down very well. And the final court case is nothing short of spectacular. It really is funny.
Does sound amazing again.
And he actually shares he shares his apartment because he hasn't got any money. He shares the apartment with another up and coming, lawyer who's trying to make some kind of way for himself, and that's the Richard Attenborough character. So while they're at the same time trying to get on as lawyers, they're also competing with each other for the affections of the blonde who lives in the apartment upstairs. So yeah, that one is a real little gem that very few people will more than likely have ever heard of, but it's a fairly decent film.
Richard Attenborough does also seem like a Boulting stalwart. I mean, obviously he was in Brighton Rock, but
Yes.
he's in all of these films. I forgot to note him down because he doesn't he play the he's in
Private Progress, isn't he?
He's in Private Progress, and he's in I'm Alright Jack. He plays the kind of upper, the guy whose factory it is, like he's like the stockholder or something, isn't he?
Yeah.
So yeah, on the subject of him, actually, has anyone? This is a bit off topic, but have any of you seen the film 10 Rillington Place? It's a kind of,
that's definitely his best role.
I mean, he is amazing in that film, Richard Attenborough.
Do you know, my grandmother used to be friends with the woman who cleaned I think maybe that house.
Wow.
Yeah, so I don't think it is that. I think it's she didn't have much contact with Christie, but she definitely kind of was in his vicinity, which I always found fascinating. But he's so good, isn't he? He's so awful and creepy and ugh.
Yeah, the only reason I mentioned it though is that there are even though these are comedies that we're talking about, there are hints of that strange kind of psychopathy that he shows in that film in his appearance in I'm Alright Jack. Those extreme close-ups the Boultings like to do, and where the characters are almost turning into grotesques. Does that make sense? You can kind of see elements of that, like the true evil that lurks within when the camera's like right up in their face, and the people are almost like, I don't know, they look kind of sweaty, and you can see the self-interest in them. So yeah, so that's one of the only reasons I mentioned that, other than the fact that he's very good in it. So
it's like a Sergio Leone extreme close-up, but before he even got into films.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is a connection. No, I know what you mean. I mean, I'm just thinking about we're not talking about this, but I'm just thinking about the moment in 10 Rillington Place where Christie is comforting the woman he's about to kill, and the audience knows what's going to happen. It's just so wretched. He's very good at doing these terrible people who you can't help but watch.
Well, isn't there something about actors that normally always play nice guys enjoying and really getting into when they get the chance to play someone really villainous? I mean, think of like Henry Fonda in Once Upon a Time in the West.
Yes.
That if you do give them the opportunity after they've done an entire career's worth of playing Mr. Nice to just once play the absolute psychotic killer.
My mind went to Robin Williams in 1 Hour Photo. Have either of you seen that one?
Yeah, I really like that, but I don't think he's the bad guy in that. But he is creepy.
He's creepy.
He is creepy. Yeah, he's very good as a creep. I think Robin Williams really should have done more as
creepy,
as a creep, because I think he had really, I think that Robin Williams, he's obviously famous for Mrs. Doubtfire and fun things like that, but I actually think he had a really good range.
No, he definitely did.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've sort of gone through Boulting, haven't we?
Do you want to go to carry on?
And I just thought before we leap to carry on, that there may be, because this is almost like a sort of a little genre of itself that was situated at that particular time period, I would say. And that is the St Trinian's films. Because you had, Alistair Sim, he was playing, at first he was sort of playing the governess's brother plus the governess, wasn't he, in the original film?
That's not a face you can trust.
Well, I mean, that's why he got to run the school for lifemanship and things like that. But they made quite a series of these films, didn't they? I mean, the academic before we came on air was sort of telling me, what was it, the hell that is St Trinian's or something like that you referred to?
I mentioned that. I think that was probably a later, lesser known one.
I think they made quite a few of them. Wasn't there sort of a second or third part done with Frankie Howard?
Frankie Howard, okay. If you look at Frankie Howard's entire career, because I don't know when else we're going to mention him. He was basically like the go-to guy to fill in for anybody else. He was always a fill-in. If you look at the roles that he usually got his movie roles because somebody else couldn't do it.
Yeah,
Like I mean, yeah, I don't know why
well,
that is.
surely Up Pompeii must have been, I mean, they couldn't have cast anyone else for Up Pompeii, could they?
Frankie, say the prologue. All right, you've got it. We're casting you.
I mean, Up Pompeii is just for any Americans out there who are not familiar with Up Pompeii, it was a TV series in which he plays the slave Lurcio, who is basically the slave to a household in Pompeii, and he always begins with the prologue, which it makes it sound all very classical, as though it's going to have a structure, but it's just a meandering load of waffle, which doesn't really seem to go anywhere. It's more about the way he delivers it. And I don't know how many times he tries to begin the prologue during the prologue.
Yeah.
And he always gets lost in it. And
Tatiana. Oh, never mind the prologue. Yeah. It's
and he always ends up telling the audience that they've got dirty minds.
So I'll give you an example, okay? We were talking about David Tomlinson before, and David Tomlinson did a film called Up the Creek with Peter Sellers, okay? It was a David Tomlinson, Peter Sellers vehicle. And then they made a sequel called Further Up the Creek, but Peter Sellers couldn't make it because he was making The Mouse That Roared. So who filled in? Frankie Howard. So it became a David Tomlinson and Frankie Howard film. So I'm just noting some of the he was in the Ladykillers as well. I'm just having a look here. He apparently
I'm
played
trying to remember what he would have presented in the Ladykillers.
He played the Barrow Boy, apparently. So very minor role.
But there's just one thing I would like to, because we've drifted off to Pompeii here. When we're talking about St Trinian's, there is actually a little known film called The Happiest Days of Your Lives that actually preceded St Trinian's, and it's kind of understood to be the St Trinian's prototype, for want of a better word, and because it's made by exactly the same people, it's pretty much got exactly the same cast, except this time round it's not Alistair Sim playing both the governess and her brother. In this particular case, it's Alistair Sim set against Margaret Rutherford. And it's a beautiful little setup whereby he is running a boys' school. And because of the war, the war's over, but because obviously that many schools have been destroyed and whatever, the education ministry is having to kind of make do. So he is informed that effectively his boys' school is going to get twice the number of pupils than usual. So he is obviously completely aghast at this idea, but he assumes quite fairly that he would get twice as many boys as usual. Except, of course, he gets a girls' school sent to him. So a kind of war erupts between the girls against the boys, but also between the female staff of the girls' school and the male staff of the boys' school.
Oh, that does sound like Carry On.
And so in this case, Margaret Rutherford is obviously the school governess, and he is the school governor, and it becomes a sort of turf war between who is actually in charge, with Alistair Sim losing more and more control of what is actually supposed to be his school. And there is one particular monologue where at one point there is a knock on the door, and it turns out to be somebody canvassing for one of the political parties during an election. And he is basically asked whether he is going to vote for this particular woman. And on learning that it is a woman, he basically starts this monologue in, basically announcing that given his recent experience, he is willing to vote for any candidate, whether it be the Communist Party, the fascists, whatever, as long as they are represented by a male candidate. But this monologue goes on for about 5 minutes, and it's worth the film. Just that alone is worth seeing the movie. Sorry, I've exhausted everything I had to say about this film, and I'm sorry for boring everyone silly on this particular subject. Please carry on.
Like many of the others you mentioned, it does sound amazing. Yeah, I would just like to give up work and spend my entire life watching all of these films, because every single one of them has got a tremendous setup, and just the idea of these people in these different situations alone makes me want to watch them. So
Well, I think this is just one of the things that, I mean, I am talking about, I'm talking as someone who's approaching 50 here gradually. And I must just say that I think a lot of young people don't seem to realize that there are all these brilliant films out there where filmmakers had to work a hell of a lot harder in order to make them, because you couldn't just hide everything behind some giant muscle man in spandex and a lot of explosions. I know that sounds terribly condescending. I'm sure it is, but yes, my opinion is what it is.
Well, I mean, I think to jump on that, I think that it's not even necessarily kind of an issue of movie making. I think that until fairly recently, kids growing up would be exposed to stuff that was on TV.
Yes.
To programming that they didn't dictate. Now you can go on Netflix, you can watch whatever you want. A lot of people don't really bother with TV, and when I was a kid, and I'm sure when people who are younger than me were kids, you end up watching a film on a Saturday afternoon that you have no interest in, but it's on.
Yeah.
And I think that's how a lot of youngsters do get exposed to things, and you're right. I think it is kind of being lost.
And
and
I've said this so many times, George. I've made this point on numerous occasions, and it's the cultural osmosis and the cultural cachet that you lose, because you're never going to catch an old episode of Steptoe and Son on demand. It's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and you're never going to end up watching something that maybe you heard of Steptoe and Son and you just thought, well, I don't care, and then you watch 10 minutes of it and you think, oh, okay, well, I'll watch another one. You're right. I mean, I think it's creating, in a way, an incredibly insular.
Well, I mean, I teach 18 and 19-year-olds all the time,
right?
And I mentioned this to British before. I was teaching a class the other day. I just wanted to make a quick throwaway reference to something, okay? And in this case, it was Reservoir Dogs.
Yes.
And I said, who has actually seen Reservoir Dogs here? This is a class of 20, 25 people. No one. And I just thought, well, I mean, and that was something that was pretty prevalent in the culture, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and it's just nobody. Their cultural cachet basically boils down to Harry Potter, which everybody's seen or read. And beyond that, you're starting to reach, and I'm not even joking, even like the Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, you cannot count on more than half of them having watched or read. And I find this all carry on.
Yeah. No, I was going to say so it's all become different niches. Is that what you're saying? It's all divided up.
It's become a kind of self-selecting culture rather than a shared culture of all of them.
Right.
Exactly. It's all self-selecting. But the thing that that has always troubled me, and it continues to trouble me, is that like I always had this notion of the gap, okay, of having gaps and wanting to fill some of those gaps in. So, like, for example, even though I haven't seen every single film that we've been discussing here, I know in my mind that this is a gap I want to fill. I do want to watch some of these films that British has been talking about, and it will be in however loose a way an aim of mine, or let's say, for example, I was into I don't know, Bowie. It would bug me if I hadn't listen to the Diamond Dogs. So I had this notion of a gap that needed to be filled, and I think that entire way of thinking does not exist with that particular generation. They do not see it as a priority. So the very fact that they haven't watched Reservoir Dogs will not bother that they. I don't know how many of them would have gone on after that class to fill in that obvious massive cultural hole in their knowledge or their experience. And that is something that I don't know how you recapture that once it's lost. So I do wonder, in like 2 generations, does the entire culture go?
And has that happened because information is always just a click away? Do you think?
I honestly think the true reason is what we were talking about. It's the like we mentioned Sleuth just now. I caught Sleuth when I was a teenager. They were showing it randomly at like 11 o'clock on that old Channel 4 slot with Mark Cousins or Mark Road. I caught so many films that way, and maybe I only caught it because I was watching Eurotrash just beforehand and I was up a bit late or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's that experience, the accidental discovery is impossible to happen if all you ever do is go through Netflix or watch your favorite YouTuber.
If everything is self-selecting, then the thing is you are not going to select something you know nothing about. If you're completely ignorant of something and you've absolutely never heard of it, why would you choose to try it out? So it just always gets skimmed.
So the entry barrier and the opportunity cost for I find myself doing this. Like, I very much struggle to watch there's always some box set or latest US show that you're meant to watch, right? And there's always like the best things in sliced bread. And apart from Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones, I have struggled to watch any of them because it's such a massive commitment. It's like, well, could I start watching The Walking Dead now? I mean, it's almost like being at the bottom of a mountain and staring up. This is going to require 80 hours of my time.
Yes,
but but this is what I'm talking about. For those kids, even if they were interested, the opportunity cost is so massive, or the entry barrier is so massive to, like, where do you even start? Because you're starting from zero, don't forget. So it's kind of like...
It is quite literally zero. I mean, to the point where I remember having a conversation with a young woman once, and at some point during the conversation, I mentioned Casablanca. Again, it's, as the academic agent was saying, it's a kind of a reference that you assume the other side understands.
Everyone knows what Casablanca is, yeah.
And I got this completely blank look, and she had never heard of Casablanca. She had no idea. And I'm sorry, but you don't know Casablanca? Surely every woman in the Western world has cried her eyes out to Casablanca. No, never heard of it. So I actually found her a copy of Casablanca and gave it to her. I said, just watch it. You'll understand. 2 days later, I met her, and she kind of toyingly slapped me across the shoulder and went, "You bastard, you bastard! I've watched it about 3 times and I've been crying my eyes out ever since." And that's just it. Once they actually get to see it, they love it. But until what will actually get them to watch it now? Previously, when you had television, you had that shared experience. Now on the internet, no matter how much choice you give them, what will ever induce them to effectively watch
a black and white film?
There's something else that has come as well, which is, I don't know if this is a generational thing again, but I remember I had a group of friends who were a little bit younger than me. So I'm in my mid-30s and they would all be in their mid-20s. Probably they're in their late 20s now. But they're just that bit younger. And one of the big differences between us was that I have always had a certain reverence for old stuff. The idea is that this is kind of a heritage thing and it's important, and regardless, even think of the TV, like the only Fools and Horses, or the Porridge, or the Open All Hours, or whatever it is. these are part of our culture, and it's kind of shared memory that we all have. I'll have memories of sitting down with my family to watch like the Only Fools and Horses Christmas special type thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
in
for
that
sure.
in that generation, they have this odd will to not only refuse to watch the things from the past, but to actively want to condemn it, to actively want to say it's good that we've moved past this. And this is something that I can't get my head around at all. That they actively wanted to say don't not only do we actively not know Only Fools and Horses, but we actively want to condemn that. We actively don't want to like it, and that's something I just don't get.
Well, and where's that from, do you think? Is it just because it looks old? Because, you speaking like that, I remember being at a friend's house, and I remember his 8-year-old son saying, "Oh, Daddy, I don't want to watch this. It's old." And it was something from 2003. And he thought it was old because it wasn't 1080p. It wasn't full
Well, I mean,
full high definition.
it's partly because it's old, but it's also partly, and I don't want this to get too political, but it's something that Britisher talks about all the time on his channel. It's partly from this kind of I hate to say it, the SJW, the social justice warrior instinct to
But it no
want
longer
to,
accords with the current
Yeah.
values.
to want to condemn the past. So the only thing that you can say about Rudyard Kipling is that he was a racist imperialist. And the only
Mhm.
thing that we can really say about Only Fools and Horses is that it was of its time, and isn't it great that we're not like that anymore? And there was a whole spate of these shows on Channel 4. I don't know if you remember it a while back. Channel 4 used to have this line in top 100 lists, and then that for some reason that changed to, oh, let's look back at the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s and titter to ourselves about how sexist they all were. Did you see those shows? It was kind of like it was all right in the 70s type of thing. Can't remember exactly what they
I
were called, but
I remember when that when that sort of thing started to become popular, and I remember it on BBC though. I mean, it must have been almost 20 years ago, and it was "I Love the 90s" or "I Heart the 90s." I
Mhm.
remember that, but I
Yeah.
don't know exactly what you're talking about here.
so yeah, around the time of the millennium, there was an awful lot of looking back and ranking. The
Right.
top 100, and that was, I mean, that was formative for uh, me back then, because it would help me. It was a kind of guide. It was a guide
Yeah.
to know what films to watch, to know what music to like. But then the tone changed, and I get you don't live in Britain now, right?
No.
So you probably wouldn't have seen this, but now that when you have shows looking back, it's much more the kind of, you know the Jimmy Savile narrative, or the
Hmm.
looking back slightly aghast at how casually somebody might place their hand on a woman's knee or something. A very different
Right. I
a
have
very
heard
different way of
something.
looking back.
Yeah, I heard this. I heard a lot of stuff about Friends, because Friends has been on Netflix.
Yes. Yes, I've
Come
heard that too.
come
Yeah.
to Netflix, and I've heard a lot of people say, um, well, I haven't seen this. I've just heard it reported that some people are outraged, because of course they are, because um, well, it as everything is of its time. It doesn't share exactly the same values. And I mean, I've watched a bit of Friends recently, and I kind of see what people mean, but I don't think it's anything to get outraged about. I mean, if you go back to Faulty Towers,
Mm.
there's an exchange of pretty racist words in at least one episode, and it's very casual because it was written and made in the 70s, and
And
that's how
when
people
they
talked.
show that
It wasn't
these days,
trying to make a point.
when they show that these days on the BBC,
Is
those
it cut?
racist words are removed. They've
Okay.
actually cut Faulty Towers.
Mm.
I know which scene you mean, George, and that's
Yes.
actually it's been broadcast in a cut version. And when I actually saw that, my jaw dropped. I couldn't believe that one would cut Faulty Towers because, yeah, I mean, again, you're dealing with something that is perfect. Why would you meddle with it? But yeah,
Well,
it's a strange.
and it's of its time. It's
Oh yes, precisely. But I don't know if you're familiar with what's he called? It's a silent era film, The General.
Oh yes, of course, Buster Keaton.
Buster Keaton, yes, and it's a marvelous movie. I mean, I absolutely love it. For people out there, I think it is available on YouTube. And
Yeah.
he is with the Confederates, and that is just the way the story goes.
Right.
And he isn't doing anything racist. He isn't a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He isn't. But again, should one condemn that film, that is a brilliant film and a brilliant comedy? Should one condemn it because, well, he's with the Confederates? And you just think, well, no, it's just of its time. Maybe it was made with Southern money or something like that. Who knows? But does it really matter? Can one not just enjoy a movie for what it is and accept that it was made at a time, and not constantly seek to somehow judge it for, its underlying values at the time of making?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can still acknowledge this stuff, and I think it should be acknowledged. Oh, well, looking back, well, that does seem pretty weird, doesn't it? To our standards today, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I don't like the idea of cutting stuff, really.
Yeah, no, the moment that you start cutting things out, then you're kind of trying to impose the present on the past.
Well, and then we're doomed because in 100 years, people will look back at stuff that's being made now, and they'll say, "What were they thinking?"
Yeah.
It's inevitable that people are going to think that. It's inevitable that in 100 years it's going to be different, and I hope that people in 100 years don't think, "Oh, that Georg Rockall-Schmidt, he was, barely known YouTuber, but one thing we did know about him, racist." you know, because I don't toe the line of the future.
There were some aspects of this I don't entirely understand, right? So when I was home for Christmas, among other things, I sat down and watched with my parents and other loved ones Carry On Up the Jungle. That was casually showing on prime time at ITV. And it seems to me that ITV is an island unto itself. I mean, there was some show on earlier on, and I couldn't believe what I mean. This is like a contemporary game show type thing, and it was. I mean, I was sitting there myself and thinking, this is retrograde. It's obviously sexist, but this is a TV the ITV have made right now, and it's showing on prime time today. So it's kind of a weird thing. I mean, it's almost depends on whether the thing is on BBC Two or Channel 4 if it's on ITV.
Why that could be, and that is because ITV is commercial. And because we know that the audiences of television, because the young people and more, the middle-aged people have more and more fled onto the internet and are watching box sets, that we know, I think the average viewer of BBC One is supposed to be in his 60s.
Really?
So I could imagine that ITV will more than likely be similar. And as opposed to the BBC, where it's all a matter of, according with BBC values, with ITV, they are interested in showing something that will sell to that particular audience. And they know they will have people of a much older vintage watching. So effectively, they might be producing to the standards of the days of the past, knowing that those are actually the standards of their actual audience at the moment. I know that sounds bizarre, but that may well be the way they're pitching it.
And I mean, I only mention that because, I mean, Carry On Up the Jungle, I did find it hilarious. I hadn't watched it in a while. But, this is a film with Bernard Bresslaw in Black Up, playing a character called, it's
Well, yes, but when it comes to Black Up and whatever in Carry Ons, that was quite common. I mean,
yeah, it's on Carry On Up the Khyber as well.
Carry On Up the Khyber, yes. Kenneth Williams plays the Kazi, and Bernard Bresslaw plays his henchman, doesn't he? Bunged It In.
You see, I can imagine circumstances where they show this on. I could imagine that there could be some SJW furore, hundreds of people complaining to the BBC that this was shown. and yet ITV show it in a very prominent slot, and nothing is said. It's very interesting how that works.
As in, my only guess there could be that they're looking at it entirely from a commercial angle, and they're thinking, well, the young people may complain, but they're not our audience. So, we can effectively afford to ignore it, because if no 20-year-olds are watching television anymore, then effectively we can afford to ignore the complaints of the 20-year-olds.
If only more companies took that line, eh?
Yeah, precisely. But anyway, we seem to have sort of I'm sort of trying to drag us back. I mean, we've touched upon Carry On Up the Khyber there, so this may be a good opportunity to sort of try and drift into the Carry On films, because sorry.
Yes. I was going to say yes. Carry On the Khyber. I watched Carry On Up the Khyber. I watched that yesterday.
Oh, did you?
I did.
What a coincidence.
Oh, did you? Yes.
What did you make? I have to. I mean, I watched it with about 5 or 6 other people, and we were drifting in and out of it. But the bits we watched, we found very funny. Cheap gags and all. But
yeah, I mean, it's funny because I haven't seen a Carry On for a long time, but I used to watch them a lot as a kid because, again, they were on TV all the time. And I went into it expecting to kind of sit there and kind of roll my eyes, but it was actually much funnier than I thought it would be. I mean, like you say, academic, cheap gags. I would call a lot of Carry On pretty cheap.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what a modern equivalent would be. I don't know if it would be something like a Rob Schneider film. I don't really mean in terms of humor, but in terms of kind of, it's silly, it's fast paced, don't take it very seriously. It's just a movie sort of thing. I mean, the one thing I really do like about Carry On is it doesn't have any illusions of grandeur.
No.
I mean, with that particular one, I mean, Carry On Up the Khyber clearly is one of their most successful. And
it's one of your favorites, isn't it?
Yes. It's clearly one of their best efforts. I mean, there is one segment which is pretty poor, I think, where they're walking around with those fake beards.
Yeah.
They're sort of among the Afghans, and I just feel that just doesn't work at all. And I strongly suspect it didn't work in its day. But some of the other stuff, I must say, is just pure class, because I really think it's them sending up the British again. And the fact that they're not just. It would be easy, looking back now, for us to sort of say, oh, well, yes, they're making all these jokes at the expense of the Indians and whatever, but they make just as many jokes at the expense of the British being there. It's almost as if they're kind of wondering, why would anyone want India, whether it's the British or the Indians?
I've sent your queen some more elephants. Oh, well, Buckingham Palace isn't that big. Yeah, but you're right. Everyone's an idiot in a way. It's everyone's a caricature, and I think you probably could argue that quite a bit of it is maybe not racist, but certainly kind of extremely stereotypical and cliched. But again, it wasn't made now.
I have to say though, I happened to catch one of those. It was a Russell Brand vehicle from the mid-noughties.
Yeah, well, he did a Trinity thing. Going back to that. Do you remember that? He did a Trinity school thing.
So he was the Trinity remake.
Thing. Yes, he was, I think, involved with one of them, wasn't he?
I can't remember what the name of this film was, but they were in Hawaii. Probably people in the chat.
Oh, Forgetting Sarah Marshall.
And I thought, my God, I mean, I think Forgetting Sarah Marshall is every bit as questionable in its politics, in its race politics than any Carry On film. In fact, I was sitting there thinking, what the hell? Like, these are the same people who lecture us on these things, but have you seen any comedies in the past, like coming out of mainstream Hollywood in the past 20 years? They're not very progressive in any single way, I would say. None of those films. So,
well, since we're kind of talking of Carry On movies, it may be worth sort of talking about some of those older Carry On movies, because Carry On, compared to the Ealing and compared to the Boulting movies, Carry On movies seem to have much more of an evolution.
Yes.
So when you look at Carry On Sergeant, it's not that far removed from something like Private's Progress in the Boulting films. So it's really sort
very
of bold.
reserved compared to
Yes,
the older
yes,
stuff, isn't
It's
it?
even got William Hartnell.
So it
involved.
really did become much broader humor and whatever later on. But at first, it began being pretty close to Boulting and Ealing.
Well,
And then,
funny enough, British Show, I can speak directly to this because I recently, and this is very sad, I bought the entire Carry On box set.
oh, then
did
well,
you?
yeah,
Yeah,
hello,
because
brother.
I was
have
thinking,
I.
well,
I have possession of the Carry On box set. Yes.
well, I was thinking, like, I mean, at one point, you know, like they're on TV all the time. Like, what's the point of buying the box set? But then I thought, you know, maybe it's something I should have. But I was also curious about the early ones because they tend to show the same ones on TV, and it tends to be the later ones, right?
Yeah.
And I basically just started watching them sequentially. So I watched Carry On Sergeant, Carry On Nurse, Teacher, Constable, Regardless, and I think I got as far as Cruising. And I know Carry On Cabby. I know them from Carry On Cabby On because Cabby. And it is actually interesting how different those early ones are, because there's a lot more of a sense of them being in a situation, and how can I put it? They're less broad and they're more observational in a way.
Do you think they're more narrative based?
More
Because
plot based, yeah, you're
they're
right.
more plot based, yeah.
Yeah,
Because we're
because they're
definitely with the
not
Khyber.
they're not constantly trying to hit
Yeah.
a pun or a catchphrase.
Yes, because with watching Khyber, I kind of, it brought it back to me how kind of similar they are to the format of something like Airplane, where it's all about the gag, and we want to gag a minute, and we want to gag within a gag, and everyone's name is a double entendre, and everything someone says is either a gag or a setup for a gag. And I don't know, maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but I don't remember the earlier ones.
No, the earlier ones were much more reserved. There is, I think, in that regard, you're right. It is more narrative based.
Yeah, and the actual characters are different from, like, so the Kenneth Williams is obviously younger in those films, and he tends to be more of a kind of, he fancies himself as a bit of an intellectual.
He's a bit of a brainiac, yes,
and he's a bit nerdier. And Charles Hawtrey is less broad in, you know, he doesn't really, I can't remember any times where he's dressing up, and there's almost like an emotional core to the films that seemed to go missing later. So I remember watching Carry On Sergeant and reaching the end and being quite touched by what happens at the end, and they're all a bit like that.
And it's all worth pointing out, of course, that Carry On Sergeant, the sergeant was actually played by the first Doctor Who,
William Hartnell.
So that was, you know, that there's a bit of trivia for you, but also Shirley Eaton being in there. Yeah, I must admit that yes, you know, whether it's in black and white or not, the lady is quite impressive. And she did go on to become the most famous Bond girl of all times. Because
gold, right?
For anyone who doesn't know, she is the lady who gets killed by being painted in gold paint by Goldfinger in James Bond. And I think that surely must rank as the most famous Bond girl of all times. I mean, that's the most iconic moment, I think, in any Bond film. But yeah, I mean, in this case, they even had people like Bob Monkhouse in there in the very early days.
I was just looking at the poster you found, and yeah, Bob Monkhouse. That's so strange to see that name there.
Yeah, you don't really connect him with Carry On, but yes, at the first episode, there he was. Yes. But I mean, we've got others. As I say, early on, I think what they did early on is they went for what I would call shared experiences.
That's
so
right,
this was not too long after the war, so Carry On Sergeant would mean a lot to most men. They would have been in the army. They would have some sort of experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously from there they go on to Carry On Nurse, Carry On Constable. So then you've got the police force, all the bobbies. Then they've got Carry On Teacher, where again, I mean, everyone's been to school. So
Yeah.
I think they kind of, went for things that anybody would kind of, anybody would have some sort of understanding of. And I think that's
And then
why,
it changed.
yeah, that's why they had, I mean, how many people know how to be the governor of India, like Carry On Up the Khyber?
Right. Yeah. Carry On Cleo. I hope. Yes.
Yeah, precisely. So
But I
clearly
suppose.
they moved away from that format at some point, but that's what kind of started them off at first. And again, they were kind of gentle, and they had, they had a different type of wit about them. One might say that they were more than likely written by posher people.
Right.
That may sound terribly, but I would assume that these were more than likely the same type of script writers who perhaps wrote Ealing comedies and Boulting Brothers comedies rather than the people who did the later carry-ons.
People who later did the carry-ons, would you say it's more backslapping, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
The first six are all written by the same guy, which a guy called Norman Hoodis.
Oh, well, there you go. See, I've learned something.
All of the others are written by Talbot Rothwell.
I mean, with Carry On Nurse in particular, if you look on the poster, the bottom there, you've got one of my favourite actors, which is Wilfred Hyde-White. And he plays the colonel who's in the private room, whereas everybody else is on the NHS. And does the daffodil mean anything to either of you?
The daffodil, no.
No, because that's that might be one of the gags just to very close to the end, where he's constantly being, he's constantly pressing his buzzer because he wants this or that to be brought to him, because he's the private patient. And at some point, the nurses have had enough of him, so they decide to get their own back. So one of them, I think, is sent in to kind of measure his temperature or whatever. But then a surprise inspection takes place by the matron that's played by Hattie Jakes, who, of course, is as an absolute, battle axe of a woman as the matron. And she walks in, and Wilfred Hyde-White is lying there on his belly. And she looks at him, slightly aghast, and he just goes, "Well, what's up, matron? Surely you've seen someone have their temperature taken before." And she just reaches behind him and picks at something and just says, "Well, of course, Colonel, but never with a daffodil." But yeah, as I say, it's a somewhat different type of humor that they're going for there.
And Leslie Phillips is around, isn't he? He seems to be part of the regular crew at that point.
In Carry On Constable, he's one of the
Bobbies.
He's one of the bobbies who is very interested in Constable Passworthy, who is a rather shapely female police officer. So you can imagine he can do his Leslie Phillips thing there. No, they did evolve, and they became a lot broader as they went on.
I think it's probably the influence of this Talbot Rothwell fellow who takes on. He actually picks his first one is Carry On Cabby, and from there on they get progressively broader.
They get broader, but they're still fairly restrained. Carry On Cabby definitely still resides in with the older ones.
I think it's one of the best ones, actually. Carry On Cabby. It's got a fantastic plot. The girl, the female, it's a great. The female cabbies try to put the male ones out of business, and they're desperate, basically.
And of course, one of the females is Amanda Barry, who then later in a Carry On goes on to play Cleo. So she is Cleopatra in Carry On Cleo. But she is one of the stunning cab drivers of the female cabs that is trying to put the male cab drivers out of business. Because, of course, they're just ordinary blokes running a cab service, and then this shark-like female taxi service opens, where all of them are absolute page 3 stunners. So, I mean, whom do the passengers want? I mean, it's hardly the balding blokes, is it?
Another interesting aspect of these early ones, thinking about Carry On Cabby, is the fact that Hattie Jakes is often often a love interest, or she's the main female lead in a lot of these, whereas obviously later on she becomes more of the female authority figure, and
Yes.
it's usually Joan Sims or one of the others who is the kind of the wife. What do you think about Hattie Jakes in the role of the she's the one playing off Sid James, or she's the one playing off Kenneth Williams, or whoever it is in these early films? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean,
yeah,
she is kind of the wife to Sid James in Carry On Cabby, but in the very early ones, she already was kind of taking on sort of authority positions. I think it was just basically she went back to that later on. But in Carry On Nurse, obviously she is the matron.
She's the matron,
kind of, the tyrant of the hospital.
That is how people have to remember her, isn't it? As the matron.
And in Carry On Teacher, of course, she is the disciplinarian.
That's right.
But basically, what's it called? Leslie Phillips is the psychologist who's visiting, inspecting the schools.
That's right.
Who's bringing all these wishy-washy liberal values as to how one has to be nice to children. And she is the one that's basically always saying, well, no, the only thing they understand is a damn good thrashing, And she clearly is the hardline disciplinarian in the school.
She's a bit kinky in that. She's a bit kinky in that one, though. She's got that little twinkle in her eye once in a while, where she's kind of like she's a little bit saucy, which is interesting.
But,
well, it's Carry On. I mean, it's always there, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's always there on the. I mean, I am a complete hypocrite. I will admit to this, because at one moment I'm quite admiring of those earlier ones, because the earlier ones were a bit more restrained and perhaps were a bit classier. But I have to say, my all-time favorite Carry On, without a shadow of a doubt, is Carry On Cleo. That one is the one I just enjoy most, and yet it is bawdy. It's got Britain's favorite Carry On, its favorite comedy line in infamy. They've all got it, infamy. But generally, it's also the reason it had such high production values for a Carry On film was because Cleopatra, the film with Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, that film had several sort of false starts. So at one point, they built a lot of sets in Britain. And then eventually they moved on to Rome to film it at Cinecittà. So of course there were all these, unused Roman sets hanging about that were made for a serious Hollywood film. And those were the sets that Carry On then used. So that's why these, the production values of Carry On Cleo were that much higher than anything else that Carry On ever turned out. So yes, they could go completely overboard with these, expensive Hollywood sets that they didn't have to pay anything for. But just generally, it's just, I don't know. I think that is the peak of Carry On. They're broad, but they haven't become too broad yet. But at the same time, they've let go of some of the restraint that they had earlier, and I really think it is the quintessential Carry On movie. Opinions?
You said that it's before they get too broad. I mean, do you think they become too bawdy? Because I can imagine showing an American a Carry On and them watching it and not knowing what on earth it is. Because I think it's so esoteric in many ways, but also it's so kind of. I'm thinking of Carry On at Your Convenience, which for some reason sticks in my mind a lot. I remember that film very well, and I remember that being quite naughty, to the point where you kind of you get halfway through it and you think, all right, I get it. I get it, tits. I get it. But maybe that's just me. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think there was clearly a point at which they became too bawdy because, by the time you get to Carry On Emmanuel, they've kind of lost it. I think that there was already some episode where I don't remember which one it is. I don't remember the title, but when they're in some seaside town and they organize a beauty contest, and already there, it's just getting a bit too much. The restraint is lacking. That basically, I mean, how often can you see someone shake their boobs around in a tight dress before eventually you just go, look, guys, I think you're losing it a bit here.
Yeah, I think that with Carry On Camping as well, which
yes, yeah,
a
precisely.
huge gag is about Barbara Windsor losing her bra,
Yes.
and yeah,
and it's a bit too much chercher la femme by middle-aged men, and it's okay for a few gags, but it doesn't make a film. Whereas when it comes to Carry On Cleo or whatever, I really think they were on form. That there was an element of that, but that was precisely it. It was an element. It wasn't the entire film.
Which is the one where they're in like the caravan park.
That's Carry On Camping.
No. There's one after. So not Carry On Camp. There's one after that where it's one of the late ones. It's all pretty sad and like none of.
Was it Carry On Abroad?
Is it Carry On Abroad?
No, Carry On Abroad is in a hotel that begins falling apart.
I want to say, is it Carry On Behind? Maybe. I think it's Carry On Behind, where it's like none of the main guys are in it. It's like Kenneth Connor mooching around, and that is one where it's starting to get pretty sad. Is it like there's a lot of Peter Butterworth in it?
I think particularly once they get sort of into the 70s, it no longer really works, does it?
That would,
I
if
agree.
I was to pinpoint one where it doesn't work, it would be Carry On Behind, which was
that's a late one.
That's a pretty late one, but that's one where I would say it's past its peak. I kind of like the Carry On Abroad where they go on that like cheap Spanish holiday and everything's a bit.
The cheap Spanish holiday and the hotel hasn't been finished yet.
I kind of like one of the things that I kind of like about Carry On in general is that it speaks to this weird British thing of like everything being a little bit shit.
yes. I wanted to mention this earlier. Going back to the Ealing comedies and things. It's a tiny thing, but one thing I always notice is how shit everything looks, because it's obviously after the war, and you've got, I think it's what's the film with Alec Guinness with the Eiffel Towers? The Lavenhill Mob.
Lavenhill Mob.
And he lives in a hotel, and this hotel is, it's not shown to be, but you can tell it's it's a cockroach infested hotel, and everyone lives in these side by side houses that have since been demolished for being health hazards and things, and it's all a bit grim. And when I watch Carry On, that's the sense I get. It's in Carry On at Your Convenience. There's all these mentions about unions, and they can never get anything done because there's always a strike. And
probably one of my favorite ones is that one. Not just
it's where the union leader is always there going, right, everybody out.
Yeah, and everyone else is like, no, I'm fine. I don't want to strike.
Yeah. And then he stands up and says, oh, by the way, I would just like to take this opportunity to let everybody know that Rovers are playing at home this afternoon.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then suddenly everybody wants to leave. Yes.
Yeah, academic. Yeah, everything's a little bit shit. I think that's a kind of important, if small, part in all of it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's another thing I like as well, which is, I mean, something I've thought about a lot, especially as somebody born in the 80s, growing up in the 90s, which was a time where people were looking back to the 60s a lot. When I was always led to believe that the 60s, and still now it kind of seems to cast a long shadow, that the 60s was this wonderful time of counterculture and social revolution and all the rest of it. But I've always had this sense that the real Britain or the real England was much more like Carry On than the
yes.
and I can't remember which one it is. It Carry On Camping where they have there's that kind of they're all the hippies are there and they're all like having this like they're all groovy and dancing, and then you see like Sid James and they all like these two different worlds clash on the field. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but my sense is that the real 60s were much more like that than the imagined 60s that we have.
Yes.
Well, I think there was an element in that respect of there being a bit of honesty in those British films, which American films may have been lacking to some degree. That American films largely, there are some exceptions, of course, but they are largely about a sort of glamorous world. Whereas Britain, with British films, for one, there wasn't the money to produce these, hyper glamorous productions. But at the same time, there was always this, no matter what the story was, that one perhaps did hint at the fact that one was living in a somewhat imperfect world. Or as you put it, that things were perhaps a little shit.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I kind of like some of the ones towards it, like the Carry On Convenience and the Carry On Abroad. One of the things I like about both of them is that it feels like everybody's there. Like there's usually one or two people missing but those feel like genuine kind of like full crew capers. Do you know what I mean?
Well,
I kind of like that.
With Carry On at Your Convenience, I agree with you. I think that's a classic. That's a very good one. Carry On Abroad, I just think that's a flawed attempt. To my mind, it really doesn't.
Which
it
is the
doesn't
one
stand
where
up.
they're all running a can't remember the name of it, but they're running the dating agency. That one.
Carry On Girls.
Is it Carry On Girls?
I'm sure it is. Let me have a look.
No, I think Carry On Girls was the one where there is the beauty contest at the. I think what you might be talking about is an early one where they're carry on regardless, where it's not so much a dating agency, it's a kind of a job center of sorts, where Sid James is kind of running some kind of agency whereby you can, you get a different job every day almost to go to. And that means that there are some things involved where dating is involved and things like that. There's all sorts of misadventures that happen. But I think that's the one you may be talking about, and that's one of the early ones, in fact, the black and white one. Carry On Regardless.
No, this one I'm thinking of is definitely a color one. It may be Carry On Loving. I want to say Carry On, but it's another one of the ones where the whole crew is there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something quite fun about those later ones where it's a little bit by the numbers, but it's kind of like it's a fun caper. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, talking of capers, because I think this is one. I think you would say that the ladies are missing most. I mean, Hattie Jakes, I don't think is in it, and whatever. I think Joan Sims may be in it. I'm not sure. Then again,
Carry On Loving.
No, it's Carry On Cruising.
Oh,
because most of the male cast are definitely there. Sid James is the frustrated captain, and then Kenneth Williams and whatever. They're his officers, and what it is he is an experienced captain that's been around for a long time, and he's surrounded himself with a very competent crew. And then, of course, he's a sort of a cruise ship captain. And then, of course, what happens? He arrives, to take on the next, to take on his cruise ship on the next cruise, and all his officers are gone. Every single person, from even the barman, is someone new. So, the ship's doctor, the first officer, everybody is a new person. And of course, it's the regular Carry On crew. And he is just absolutely appalled because, as far as he's concerned, they're all incompetent nitwits. And it's a story first of everything going wrong, and then of the rest of the crew kind of getting together, saying, "Well, look, we'll kind of have to pull our fingers out here and actually, win the favor of our captain and show that we can actually do a decent job here." So perhaps it's kind of got aspects of the earlier films of Carry On Sergeant or whatever, where one in the way tries to do the right thing towards the end, But at first, yes, they're all completely incompetent buffoons, and you've got Sid James putting in quite a good performance as the grouchy captain who's just sick to the back teeth.
It's just struck me, Britisher, as you're talking, that's the final Norman Huddis screenplay. But it's just struck me that those early films are all about that, aren't they? It's a crew who are incompetent, and it's almost like a kind of coming of age or coming together to make good in the end.
Yeah,
It's the police academy formula.
Yes, precisely. Well, well put. It very much is the police academy formula. Yes, that they're complete buffoons who then eventually become a proper force because they put in the effort.
Wow, we finally, that's some good film criticism there. We nailed the early Carry On film.
Sid James is effectively Commandant Lazard, except in his own inimitable way. He's not talking about the many recruits he has, but instead he's just basically telling them all that they're complete nincompoops.
Yeah.
Of the later ones, one of the ones that stands out for me, and it's probably because Harry H. Corbett is in it, is Carry On Screaming. That one feels different from all the others. I don't know if it had a higher budget or if it's just because there's a different lead.
Yeah, I think it's because there's a different lead. I think it's because something changes the mixture of the team. I know someone who says it's his favorite Carry On film, and I just don't see it. To me, that particular Carry On film doesn't work for me.
It's almost like not a Carry On film.
Yes, something about it doesn't quite work. And I think it is because Corbett does somehow change the mix. Not just him, it's also what's she called? The leading lady, the vampire woman. So basically the beauty in the film again is not someone who's actually regular to Carry On and who gives it a completely different feel. So it kind of, with two of the main characters in the movie not actually being regulars, it just doesn't feel right.
I felt that about Teacher, which I watched when I was. That's got quite a few of the
Yes, no, I agree with you there. It has got a slightly different feel to it, but at that point, I think they didn't quite know what they were looking for because that was very early on in the series.
Yeah. What do we think of the absolute worst ones?
Well, probably Carry On Emmanuel.
I mean, apart from Emmanuel
didn't they somewhere in the 90s actually try to make another Carry On?
Yeah, Carry On Columbus.
Yes, I think we can put forward that one as more than actually the worst of all times.
Yeah, it's not really real.
Well, yes, but it's got the Carry On moniker to it, so I think we can just basically just torpedo that one right from the start.
Okay.
What about the Dick Whittington one? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I was just about to say Carry On Dick. I remember because Sid is Dick, isn't he, in that? And
yes, and I think he. I
remember that being a real groaner.
He reprises his kind of Carry On Henry performance there. Really, it's just different costumes because at one point he plays Dick Whittington, and at the next moment he's Henry VIII, and it's pretty much one and the same thing, really. Is everybody still there, or have I killed the conversation stone dead?
No.
They have a lot in the hospital, don't they? They return to the hospital many times.
Yes. I think because Carry On Nurse early on was such a success, they tried to recapture that. So it's Carry On Nurse, Carry On Doctor.
Carry On Again Doctor, is it?
Carry On Matron.
Yes, Carry On Matron. There could be a Carry On Again Doctor. I'm not sure.
I think there is one. I want to say Jim Dale features heavily in that one.
Is Jim Dale? Is that the chap who's in Carry On Cowboy?
Yeah, he's in a lot of them. Jim Dale. He's usually the young love interest.
Yeah, the young love interest sort of / straight man.
Yeah. I think he's quite an underrated.
No, he does a decent job. He is also the chap who who basically climbs out onto the roof in one of these hospital ones in order to save Barbara Windsor, who he thinks is trying to kill herself.
That's right.
Whilst she is actually just wanting to sunbathe on the deck on the roof. So obviously she thinks she's being molested by a pervert who because obviously she's taken her bikini top off or whatever, and then basically along lurks Jim Dale, who's trying to prevent her from throwing herself off the roof.
I like him in Pete's Dragon. If anyone's seen that, Jim Dale. Anyone seen Pete's Dragon?
No, I can't help you there.
No.
I want to say that Carry On Cowboy is one of the ones I haven't. When I'm thinking of the ones I haven't seen, I think Carry On Cowboy and maybe Carry On Spying. I can't remember. I feel like I've seen all of the others, but
I've definitely not seen Carry On England, which is one of the last ones.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that one.
Carry On England.
Yeah. I mean, I've got the box set, but I think towards the very end, I've never bothered.
No, I understand.
Winter Davis, isn't it? No, I haven't seen that one either.
I think with Carry On Cowboy, sort of the essential premise is that Jim Dale, or whatever he's called, he's actually a plumber. And he arrives, I think, in the wrong office somewhere in immigration, and introduces himself as William P. Marshall or whatever. And he's obviously walked into the office where they're looking for some lawman to be sent out west. And with him being called Marshall, they actually assume that's his profession. So this
I see. And
sanitation engineer or whatever gets sent out to one of the worst towns in the West, in order to bring the law. And of course, he's completely useless. And Sid James, I think, is the villain, who is kind of the tyrant among the town that basically runs it his way.
The Rumpo Kid.
The Rumpo Kid, that's it, precisely.
Yeah.
I definitely haven't seen that one. Maybe I'll crack it out with a box set.
It's one of the better ones, I must admit. It is one of the better ones. And they do all enjoy their accents. I mean, they really ham up the American accents in that one. I think the American viewers might enjoy watching that one just because how atrocious they will think the American accents are.
Jim Dale became what he ended up doing is he became like a narrator on audiobooks, and apparently he did all Harry Potter books. And then I think Stephen Fry did them again. But
so he did Jim Dale out of his earnings, did he? He just the moment Jim Dale thought he was such a good thing, Stephen Fry just steamrolled him.
Stephen Fry said, "I don't need the money, but I'll have it."
I had this little a while, but I mean, I'm an unusual chap. I think it's fair to say, and I remember it was kind of early on. It was before it was when it was still 56 KB type internet, early 2000s, I would say. I had this period where I was looking up what various people were up to, and everybody had their own rubbish little websites. So I'd look up Andy Crane, what's he doing? And he had one of those yellow MySpace websites, if you'd like to book Andy Crane for an appearance, click here type thing. And I remember one night looking up to see what Jim Dale had been up to, and that he basically had his own website doing Harry Potter audiobooks, and apparently he made quite a decent amount of money doing that as the voice of Harry Potter for everybody who listened to audiobooks before Stephen Fry started.
That was until that complete bastard Stephen Fry came along. Yes.
So there we go. There was a couple of other little things I wanted to mention about the cast members. I mentioned Hattie Jakes being a bit kinky in some of those early ones. She of course was married to John Le Mesurier, who's in a lot of these films that we've been talking about. Do you guys know about their unusual arrangements as a couple?
No, I was not familiar of John Le Mesurier. I wasn't even aware that John Le Mesurier and Hattie Jakes were a couple.
John Le Mesurier and Hattie Jakes were married, and John Le Mesurier was an alcoholic. Okay, he used to drink a lot. Hattie Jakes was a nymphomaniac, and she wanted to have sex a lot, and John Le Mesurier did not want to bother. So basically, she ended up taking on a lover, and they
lived with him.
And they lived with him, and so Le Mesurier, like a common scene would be Le Mesurier would be downstairs, drinking whiskey, drowning in sorrows, and she'd be upstairs banging away with this chap.
It's kind of a remarkable story, because I don't think most people would think Hattie Jakes did herself a great many favors with her figure if she was an nymphomaniac.
I know, because she's like pretty big in some of those later films, isn't she?
I mean, she becomes...
Well, to quote Rick Mail in Blackadder, it gives you something to hang on to.
So
she's. I mean, I think she's got the perfect sort of physique for what she was doing in terms of her career.
Yes, I mean, she fulfilled. She filled that role, that persona of that kind of large, somehow powerful woman that kind of just breezes in and basically starts ordering people about, whether they want to be ordered or not.
I'd do what she said. But that's me.
I mean, yes. I mean, as you say, I mean, Carry On. When she's in Carry On Nurse and she's the matron. I mean, that is her quintessential role.
Yes.
Because, I mean, doors get opened for her, nurses stand to attention, doctors scurry out of the way. I mean, she's this battle axe that just basically breezes into a ward, and everyone lives in complete terror. And isn't it that all the patients are kind of told to get into bed or whatever? Everybody must obey matron, as though she was some kind of royalty that sweeps in. And of course, all the patients are completely bemused as to why they should humor this woman, But that's never really explained to them. It's just because it's matron.
So a question I had for you two was, if you were thinking about the regular cast, who would you say really needs to be there for it to feel like a Carry On film?
Okay, definitely Hattie Jakes.
So you need Jakes. Okay.
Yes, you need Williams.
I don't think you need Hattie Jakes.
Oh, you do? Okay, that's interesting.
No, because I think, I mean, I'm just referring to my own favorite Carry On, which is Carry On Cleo, and she's not in Carry On Cleo.
Okay.
So I think if you've got Sid James and you've got Kenneth Williams, those are basically the two chaps that tend to hold it together. And
I think for me it's Jake Sims, Sid James, and Kenneth Williams. I think they're the four people I consider the core of Carry On. But like you say, they're not.
We've got Hattie Jakes. Then we've got what is it? Kenneth Williams, you say?
Yeah.
Just basically that people can put some kind of face to these people.
Sure.
Then Joan Sims. We've got another one in a nurse's uniform here. And who was it? So basically Kenneth Williams, Sid James, Joan Sims, and Hattie Jakes.
For me.
For you. Academic? Where would you go with that?
I just want to mention very quickly that Joan Sims is completely over the top in that film we watched the other night, the Naked Truth. Not her best turn.
I think that's before her Carry On days, I would say.
Yeah,
it's more than actually one of her earliest roles, and she's just basically told to be hysterical.
I think you need Williams.
You need Williams, yes.
I think he is.
You need Williams, yeah.
The most. I actually think some of the ancillary characters or the secondary characters also help to make it feel like you need to have Charles Hawtrey running around. I would say.
Yes, actually, yes, that's a very good point. I would actually put him in there in my needs to be in it really category.
I want to say Bernard Bresslaw as well makes it feel like just the idea you've got this little skinny chap running around, and then you've got you've got the big tough but slow guy.
How about
Kenneth Connor?
Kenneth Connor, precisely. He was pretty much, a major character in several of them.
He's big in the early ones, isn't he?
Yes.
I thought he didn't start doing them until Cruising, or am I wrong?
No, he was already a Carry On nurse, and yes, already.
Okay, I'm wrong then.
Sergeant, he was one of the. He was the one in Carry On Sergeant. He was the sickly soldier who always thought he had every condition known to man.
That's right.
Right, he was the shirker.
Tends to stutter a lot in those early ones. He's kind of like a mummy's boy or a he's similar in a number of them, isn't he? Isn't he in the cop one as well, the Carry On Constable?
In the Carry On Constable, there he isn't the sickly one, he's just the superstitious one. He has every superstition that you could possibly have. And eventually I think it's Hattie Jakes who's the female sergeant who kind of has words with him and tells him, well, I understand you're superstitious, but surely you're not that superstitious that you really are bothered whether the woman you're interested in here is born under the right star sign.
I have to be honest, I find him a bit irritating in those early films. He was probably my least favorite aspect of them, watching them again recently.
I mean, in Carry On Cleo, of course, he plays one of the captured Britons alongside Jim Dale.
Oh, yes.
Who gets mistaken for the heroic fighter. And in fact, he's got a yellow streak running down his back. But whenever trouble erupts, some coincidence emerges which assures that he turns out to look as though he were the heroic victor. So he becomes kind of Caesar's champion, doesn't he, as the defender of Julius Caesar, whereas in reality he's completely useless in any fight. I seem to have this absolute talent at the moment of bringing the conversation to a dead stop. Beginning to terrify myself here.
I've just noticed that on the BFI Top 100 films, Carry On Up the Khyber ranks at number 99.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah, I think that's the only Carry On the whole list, but it's just interesting to see one of them rank.
Well, I think there is something just quintessentially British about Carry On films that is very, very difficult to explain. But I don't know if that is still the case for the millennial generation.
It almost celebrates how naff it is, and yes. I think that is quintessentially British. I think it's much easier for British film and TV to really kind of ridicule Britain and what it is to be British than it possibly is for American TV to do that about Americans.
Yeah, no, I think it's well said. Yeah, there is just, but I think there is something that basically we kind of revel in that side of things. Also in our television sitcoms and whatever, if you look at Only Fools and Horses, I mean, that's hardly people living the high life.
Yeah, it's like Academic said, everything's just a little bit shit.
Yeah. And I mean, even when you go to the very beginnings of it, really, if you go back to Dad's Army, which I would regard as the mother of all sitcoms in that respect, it's already kind of looking at the imperfection of it all.
Britain's darkest hour.
In more ways than one, if you have to rely on Captain Mannering.
Yes. And Private Pike, yeah. I mean, you're done for, really, aren't you?
Well, chaps, I am being summoned.
You're being summoned.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. Well, I think in that case, gentlemen, are there any sort of final words that anybody has on this? Because I think we've almost talked early British film comedy to death here, haven't we? Today?
Yeah, you go first, George.
I was just going to say, I think that we've I think with what we were just saying, I think what you said, Academic, about things being a little bit shit in all of these things, I think that's a kind of uniting sort of theme, even if it's not very, very present or very done in everything. What I really do like about these is even when movies are dry, such as the movies we've been discussing are dry in something like Kind Hearts and Coronets, I think it's often maybe it doesn't seem obvious, but I think it's often really kind of mocking itself and mocking its surroundings in a nice way, but it is there. I don't think any of these things take themselves very seriously, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, my final thing is that one thing I didn't mention is that I do. It's very difficult to put this into words, but I like inhabiting the world of these films for the hour or so that the hour and a half or so that I watch them. I kind of like there's something about the settings, the world of the mid-century, of the 50s and the 60s, and even the 70s to an extent. I kind of feel comfortable and happy to inhabit those spaces in a way that I'm not happy watching, like Forgetting Sarah Marshall, for example. It's very difficult to put that into words, but there's something about the eccentricity of the characters, the slight drabness of the of the of the world, the kind of the wood. I know this sounds like an odd thing. The fact that there's not, the fact that everything's kind of chunky and tangible. There's something, I don't know. There's something about that.
There's less of a veneer, isn't there?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing because obviously I was not around in the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s, but I've always felt kind of happy back there. And it may just come from like growing up watching these things on TV or whatever, but I don't know. Just seems like a different time, and in some ways a more innocent time, despite the bawdiness.
Yes.
I think what
more restrained.
I think what British has said is true. Is that once you show, once you reveal the flesh, or once you cross the line, it somehow dissipates, the source of the joke in the first place, and all of a sudden you have to be I don't know, less inventive or less clever. So, yep.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've pretty much, done this one as far as we can. I think we've arrived pretty much at the understanding that British comedy films more than likely rely on the deep British philosophy that, underneath it all, perhaps everything is a little bit rubbish. So, that said, that is all from the Cyberpass for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.